but now they said they could. Okay, good morning again, or afternoon or evening, wherever you are, and welcome again to the Symposium on Data Analytics for Anti-Corruption in Public Administration. We have an exciting agenda lined up for the next 4 days for this hybrid event. I'll go over the agenda in a bit more detail following the opening panel discussion. We have a few people here in the room in Washington, and some people will be presenting during the course of the 4 days from here, but we have a great many people connected by Zoom. About 500 have registered. We encourage you to use the chat function to submit questions and comments. If you're following on social media or want to contribute on social media, you can use hashtag DAAPA. And we also wanted to let you know that all the sessions are being recorded. And now for welcoming remarks, I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Ed Olowo-Okere, the World Bank's Global Director for the Governance Global Practice. Ed, over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this symposium on data analytics for anti-corruption in public administration. You will all agree with me that this is a very important topic. The problems that corruption poses are well known to all of us. You need only to look at headlines around the world to see that corruption is evolving. And there is little patience for the secrecy in which corruption thrives. At the same time, the exponential growth in data availability brings potential for improvements in our understanding of corruption and in the ability to prevent and uncover corruption. We often talk about the value of transparency for the fight against corruption. At the World Bank, we support high-definition transparency because we know that corruption thrives in darkness and secrecy. This symposium brings together the very current trend in preventing and uncovering corruption. As much as the work in this area is experimental, the importance of sharing approaches and insights cannot be overemphasized. So let me provide some context to this symposium that we are having today. The papers that will be presented were proposed by authors from around the world, following the World Bank's call for papers last December. I was happy to share that call for proposals, and I am delighted today to see the results. Authors submitted papers in 4 thematic areas. First, in the area of new data-driven approaches to detecting and measuring corruption. Second, in the area of using new data sources and methods to measure the impact of corruption. Third, papers were submitted in the area of using open data to assess the effectiveness of anti-corruption tools, policies, and intervention. And fourth, and lastly, in the area of contributing new knowledge on data access, quality, and privacy issues. An expert panel evaluated the 60 submissions we received, and 24 were selected to participate in this symposium. We are partnering with the Cambridge University Press to publish these papers in a special collection of the Data and Policy Journal. And you may all look forward to that publication. The breadth of data used in the papers that will be presented in this symposium is very impressive. They include social media data, audit reports, deferred prosecution agreements, real estate transactions, crime statistics, surveys, satellite data, and many others. We look forward to the presentation of these papers and to continuing to advance our research program on this important agenda of anti-corruption. Before I conclude, I would like to thank all the authors and our panelists in this symposium. Also, I wish to extend special thanks to all our partners. Let me begin with the Korean Development Institute School of Public Policy and Management. They provided financial support for this event. We also benefited from the expertise of and collaboration with the Center of the Study of Corruption at the University of Sussex, the Government Transparency Institute, the Alan Turing Institute at the University of Warwick, the GovLab at the New York University, the Data and Policy Journal and Cambridge University Press, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, and lastly but not the least, the Development Bank of Latin America. So let me wish all participants a very productive and successful symposium this week. Back to you, Jim.
Thank you, Ed, for those welcoming remarks. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Karen Allen, a Senior Research Advisor at the Institute for Security Studies in Johannesburg. She will be the moderator.
Jim, I'm not sure if the audience can hear you, but I can't hear you. Jim.
I think the audience can hear.
Okay, so let's just give Jim a few minutes to connect or reconnect. The audience cannot hear Jim.
Brittany, the stream can hear, right? Apparently those streaming can hear, but we're having a challenge getting everyone to hear, the Zoom participants as well.
Jim, we can see you now.
Okay, thank you. I'll try from a different microphone to be sure everyone can hear.
We can see, but still cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
You are currently muted. So maybe unmute and make sure you are using the right microphone. So, Jim, I'm not sure the audience will still be able to hear you.
Can the audience hear me?
Ed, do you want me to pick up?
So maybe, Karen, you can pick up, and maybe I can forward my link to you, Jim, and disconnect so that you can be able to connect.
Thanks very
Karen,
much.
over to you.
Many thanks, Ed. And isn't it, it's one of the joys of working with these new digital tools that sometimes they let us down, but most of the time they really are transformative. Well, it really is a great pleasure to be moderating this opening session. As a former international journalist doing a lot of investigations into corruption, both with and without some of these new data tools, it's a subject that really is very close to my heart. And my goodness, how timely it is. Pandora's box, very much in the news, which exposed 11.9 million records. Well, it's once again shone the spotlight on the need for greater transparency in the financial systems that enable the concealment of the proceeds of corruption. At the same time, the growing availability of open data generated by governments is making it possible for the emergence of new data analytics tools and new methods and a surge of innovation in academia, as we're seeing already from our esteemed panelists here. Well, from our opening panel, we'll hear the perspective of corruption researchers, those working on anti-corruption advocacy and investigative journalism on the ground. And the growing use of data in anti-corruption is very much our theme. So without further ado, I hope you'll join me in welcoming Professor Alina Mungiu-Pippidi. She's Professor of Democracy Studies at the Hertie School in Berlin. Delia Ferreira, she's the Chair of Transparency International. Professor Elizabeth David-Barrett, the Professor of Governance and Integrity at the University of Sussex and Director of the Centre for the Study of Corruption. And Emilia Díaz-Struck, ICIJ's Research Editor and Latin America Coordinator based in Venezuela. We also, just to again, we have in the audience Professor Chi Liu, who's Professor at the School of Public Policy and Management at the Korean Development Institute. He's with us in his role as a sponsor of the symposium, so I'd like to acknowledge his presence here today. We'll of course encourage you that are watching this to consider submitting questions via the chat function. We hope to be able to have an illuminating discussion over the next hour and a bit, just under an hour and a half, I think. But I think without further ado, I'd like to begin our questions. And first of all, Delia Ferreira, can I put this to you? You're leading Transparency International, which everyone knows is a global advocacy organization in the fight against corruption. Is it fair to say that we're experiencing a data revolution with the emergence of these types of new tools? And what part does it play in your advocacy role at Transparency International?
Thank you, Karen, and thank you for the invitation, and congratulations on the initiative. Really very timely, very useful, and we are in a revolution. When we started the work of Transparency International, and of course, information and data is key to our work, but not only in the sense of the fight against corruption, but also for good governance, democratic representation and participation, etc. But when we started 30 years ago, we have to start to guarantee the right to access to information. In many countries, that doesn't exist. Nobody talked about the right to access to information. Then we have to start asking for information, sending petitions, written ones with signature, lots of bureaucratic things. Then we start pushing for proactive information. So asking governments to give us the information without the need to wait for us to ask the information. Then we went to mandatory information in web pages, portals from the government. And for the principle of information is open by default, which is what we are pushing now as a general principle. And then to open government and e-government, e-procurement, open contracting, and that's in terms of the institutions. But in terms of data, the availability of data and these analytics tools has really changed the panorama. And we have moved from very scarce data to statistics and then to real-time data in order to take decisions, etc. What are we doing with the data now? We are using this in many fields in the anti-corruption work that our chapters are doing in terms of public procurement transparency, beneficial ownership transparency, very timely and updated issue, if you are aware of the FATF meeting last week. Also in asset declaration, budgetary resource execution or management, public subsidies and public services, particularly during COVID, this has been very important. And the big data that we can access now, plus the computing capacity to work with that, because if without that capacity, it would be very difficult to use the data. We are using that to prevent corruption, to map risks of corruption, to detect patterns of possible corruption and raise red flags. And very important, I think, is the possibility to combine databases. So to use data in an interoperatively way. So we need databases that talk to each other in order, for instance, to trace the origin of money in campaign finance, or to detect conflicts of interests, or who is really the provider in a contract, and things like that. And of course, this allows us not only to generate awareness, but also to propose new public policies, data-driven public policies. So I will leave it now here for the conversation with my colleagues.
Delia, thank you very much indeed. And I have to say, one cannot overstate, as far as I can see, the potency of these tools. I'm talking to you from South Africa. We have elections coming in just over a week's time. And I was listening to the radio this morning, and people were being encouraged to check on some open data platforms, some of which you probably know about, to check whether there is actual service delivery happening in their particular areas because of the concerns about corruption. So thank you very much for shedding some light on that for us. Some of the examples that you give, that the probity, the budgetary resources, public services, public procurement, that has resonance globally, it really does. Well, Professor Alina Mungiu-Pippidi, a two-part question to you. How has the growing availability of data impacted corruption research and anti-corruption practice? That's the first question. I put a two-part question, but let's go with that first of all, because you've been quite instrumental in setting up various databases and various tools. Tell us a little bit more about that. I think you're muted.
Thank you very much, and wonderful to see that so many people have started to contribute to this area, making really a difference. So I would say, like, 2 points of optimism and 2 points of caution, right? The points of optimism are, first, that yes, it's great. It's not great for research, but it's great for both Delia and you, Karen, mentioned, for monitoring. Because after all, the reason why we need these measurements are to be able to trace change, to be able to see if anti-corruption interventions, if anti-corruption policies have some effect, if countries finally start to improve. So I think that the key word here is really monitoring. And we do not want, only specialized researchers here. We really want journalists, we want anti-corruption activists, and we want simple citizens whose right might be abused to be able to use these new tools and check on their governments themselves. This is what is really fabulous. Because, 7 years ago, we had this research project to which some of the panelists today, in fact, the panelists after this panel were present. Some of them were just out of graduate school, like Mihaly, Fazekas, and we pioneered a number of tools like, political connection, checking the big winners of public procurement contracts against donations to political parties or against financial or conflict of interest disclosures of politicians. In other words, checking if people with authority were themselves attributing themselves the big chunks of public money. At the time, I must say, our competitiveness of public procurement or agency capture. What is the percentage of public contracts that a government agency attributes to one single provider? It sounds like such a rough indicator, but it's fantastically, effective to see if somebody buys everything from toilet paper to nuclear rockets from just one provider and to whom it gives, 80% of their budget. And at the time, there were very few countries when we could do this on an automated basis. In fact, I think that gracious Prime Minister Viktor Orban were among the few who actually had this data out, so Mihaly, Fazekas could compute it automatically. In other countries, students really had to go into archives and take pictures with their digital cameras, and then we had to add by hand, one by one, to be able to come up with significant patterns, with representative patterns. So it's really great to see that, that 7 years later, the number of countries where we can do this increased. This is indeed great. On the other hand, we have to be aware that the level of transparency is still not very high. Yes, we're not with 2-3 countries where we can do this, but I have just finished a review of 130 countries of computer-mediated transparency. In other words, we looked exactly if this kind of databases, which are useful for anti-corruption, are out there. Right? And then when you do this, you see that even in this group of 130 countries, which excludes the poorest countries, the countries in conflict, so the other countries can only be worse, right? Even in this group, essential information like public expenditure tracking systems, where you can really check on expenses of the government in detail, now not just the big picture. Open public procurement portals, where you can really go and see what the government spends. Financial disclosures and conflict of interest of officials, but online, that you can check online, right? These are under 20%, even in this select group of countries. The other countries are just not there. So, sometimes you hear this complaints from countries which have really come a lot by way of transparency and of e-government. Countries like Mexico or Brazil or Ukraine, who have done a lot, who have even received awards for having fantastic platforms, but you hear people very discouraged, saying, okay, so now we have transparency, but it does seem that that it's not enough. So there's this big question hanging over us, which is transparency not enough to handle corruption, or is it actually not enough transparency around the world? And I think the answer is both. There is absolutely insufficient transparency, and we have to fight for this transparency. This is not the business of researcher, or all of us, we use data scrapers, We worked for this big DigiWiz project. We worked with the Cambridge IT department to do data scraping, but it's not data scrapers or hackers who have to do this. Okay, it's actually, I would warn against this, because you don't like to receive selective information. You don't know if somebody gives you the information, you don't know, whom they selected and whom they left out. We really want all the information, and we have to continue to push for transparency. And yes, the second part of the question, and that's my second warning, the second part of the question is also true, while there is big grounds for optimism, because when you look around the world at all the determinants of corruption, at the variables which are closely correlated with corruption, there is one going up and up and up, which is, the green color that we love to see on the map in our convention color, where, good governance is green and bad governance is red. And this one is e-government. Is e-government, online services offered by government, increasing data on internet, and it can only go up, okay? It's not gonna go backwards. So this is great, all right? But on the other hand, this is not the only determinant of corruption. And other equally essential, in fact, if I could speak in statistical terms, more powerful factors, freedom of the press and judicial independence, they have not been going better. Actually, in fact, freedom of the press has only regressed in the past 10 years. So let's say people do find out things, they can monitor, they can compute these indicators, but they may be unable to report this in their own country without significant cost for them. And judicial independence, it's not been regressing so much, but it's not been progressing. We really do not have aggregate progress on the average in the world on judicial independence. So yes, people might see that the government is corrupt, but do not expect that magistrates will do something about it, or rather use elections, use naming and shaming, because we still have to do quite a lot of effort. And my guess is that it's magistracy and the judicial who are going to be the latest contributors to all this revolution, which is powered by data. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good point, Alina. It's sort of one arm or multiple arm in a multiple pronged approach that's needed. You can tell policymakers that you've identified corruption, but actually translating it into an anti-corruption policy is something quite different. Thank you very much indeed. I mean, and I guess they say information is power. So, you know, one would hope, and one has seen instances of it around the world, as to information enables people to build up a advocacy base to be able to try and push for change. But I accept it's a bit of an uphill struggle in many settings. Liz, David-Barrett, can I talk to you now? Academia is playing an increasingly important role in the anti-corruption research sphere, and you run a university research program devoted precisely to that, to the study of corruption. How do you make the link between research programs and actual public administration reform? And I suppose that basically follows on from what Alina was talking about. How do you convert academia and some of the findings into concrete action?
Yeah, so I think there are sort of two ways of looking at this. One is in terms of the education and teaching that we're doing. So we've got 2 master's programs at Sussex on corruption and governance, one that's completely online and one that's on campus in Brighton. And so we're thinking about our role in training the next generation of anti-corruption practitioners and activists. And so part of that is that they should know about the latest innovations in the use of data, all of those many different types of data that Delia and Alina have talked about, everything from things that governments are publishing to the leaks of data, often from private sector companies that are being used by investigative journalists. So we need people to know about that range of data and be able to think about what other data sources they could spot and utilize. But we also really need them to be critical and informed users of data. So we think that a key skill is being able to look behind that data, and we're encouraging our students to think about who collected the data, what was their agenda, and what was their capacity. And by agenda, I don't necessarily mean, although partly it's about sources of bias, but also what was the purpose in collecting it and what they might have then missed out. So lots of sources of data that we're using now were not collected with the purpose of measuring corruption. Which is quite a move on, in fact, from those sort of early surveys of corruption and of perceptions of corruption. So we need to think about, what was the purpose? How might that have shaped what data was collected? And also the capacity. So Alina's mentioned the work of Mihaly Fazekas, and in our work together, one of the things we've constantly found in looking at procurement data is this issue that not many governments have got the administrative capacity even to collect up that data in a usable form, let alone to publish it. So there's another prior step, even before the sort of, are they willing to be transparent? Have they got the capacity to collect up all of that data from different agencies? So we're really getting students to think about that and about the need for data infrastructure. But then your other part of your question was around then connecting that to public administration reform. So that's also really key. There's absolutely no point in having great evidence if you've got no way of acting upon it. So researchers need to have relationships with policymakers. And what I would say is that relationship has to begin very early on. So in academia, we always used to talk about dissemination of results. But actually, if you only start to engage once you've got results, then there's a big risk that nobody's listening or that you're answering the wrong question, which is not currently on the policy agenda. So the implication of that is actually we need a constant dialogue between researchers and policymakers. We need to understand what they're concerned about as policymakers, where the agenda's going, and we need to be able to feed into that. And that's not easy because the timeframes are often really different. So in academia, we're doing really thorough and rigorous research. It's important that it's done in a very rigorous and robust way. And so that often means it's slow. Whereas the policy agenda is quite often, the minister's concerned about this summit that's coming up next month. We need something to put on the table. So again, that constant ongoing dialogue is really important to be able to anticipate and for academia to be able to slightly feed into that agenda and the framing of the policy process, as well as then feeding in with evidence.
Liz, just a quick follow-up, and just literally in a couple of sentences. How do you sell the idea to governments that actually becoming much more sort of digitally literate, using some of these data tools actually benefits them? Because in some ways, it's a bit like turkeys voting for Christmas. You know, they're exposing their inner workings, they're often exposing corruption, which they don't want, they being sort of, obviously elites don't want others to see. How do you sell this to them as a good thing from their point of view?
Yeah, no, you've really hit the nail on the head there. And of course, you know, former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair famously says in his autobiography what a nincompoop and what an idiot he was for passing the Freedom of Information Act and for promoting that. So, you know, governments are often quite hostile to being open. You know, what we found in some of our research is that actually not talking about it necessarily in terms of accountability and scrutiny, but talking about it in terms of efficiency can be really useful. So most governments, you know, at least some reformers within government, particularly often in the finance ministry, will be concerned about saving money. And so getting those people on side and talking in terms of efficiency, I think can be really important and something that could be quite relevant now in this post-pandemic or within still the pandemic era, where of course governments are really looking for ways to save money.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Liz. Emilia Díaz-Struck, the ICIJ has been very much in the news in recent weeks and years, I should say, most recently because of the Pandora Papers. One of the research tracks for this symposium is focused on expanding our understanding of the constraints and challenges around data quality, access, privacy issues in the anti-corruption space. Can you tell us about the data challenges that you faced in putting together and analysing the information that was contained in the Pandora's Papers? I mean, let's break that down. Start off, for example, with the issue of verification.
Yes, well, thanks very much. It's great to be here. There are a few things connected to data that we face when we work on our huge data projects. In the case of the Pandora Papers, we're talking about more than 11.9 million records, 2.94 terabytes of data. And that data, out of that data, only 4% came in spreadsheet format. And it was tied to 14 different providers, like companies that provide services to registered companies in offshore jurisdictions. Each one had its own shape and format. And it's what was kind of like a big data tsunami where like you had millions of PDFs, some of them 10,000 page long. You had documents, emails, all in, like it was really a big mess. So before, like to begin with, we had to put order to that mess data-wise. And for that, like we use a lot of different approaches and technologies to be able to basically structure the information and know, for instance, who are behind offshore companies. So who are the beneficial owners that are connected to companies registered in different jurisdictions like the British Virgin Islands, Panama, Seychelles, and so on. So the first step was like basically to understand that mess and try to combine similar types of documents, forms, registries, and so on to be able to put order to that kind of chaos. And then we also put all those files into a tool that our tech team has developed called DataShare that basically allows you to OCR all the files, make them searchable, do batch searches so you can actually upload lists of CSV files and so on to basically connect and say, well, let's check all public officers against the data. Let's check all contractors against the data, and that country by country. And our effort didn't only involve technology. We worked with more than 600 journalists in 117 countries. So, but data-wise, we did different things. So for instance, we used machine learning on one side when we were dealing with these crazy PDFs and trying to extract information from forms, because it was like basically documents that were scanned that later on, like it was not easy to handle. So in some cases, there were handwritten forms. So those we had to manually extract and structure. Then there were other table formats. So we needed to standardize and put all that together. And then something that we used to was graph databases to basically visualize and start visualizing the connections between the companies and officers. And that's the beginning. And then we have to talk about all the reporting and all the analysis to see what were these companies used for. So then we said we found more than 330 politicians and high-level public officers from more than 90 countries. Out of those, 35 current and former country leaders. And to get to that level, we had to actually cross-check against public records and see, are these the same people? Check against date of birth, check against addresses, check against a lot of public information to see, are these the same people? Then we went, and not only for the politicians, but also for all our for all our data that we were extracting, we cross-check against public records. We had to check, are these companies, do they really exist or not? So there is a lot of time our team spends in validating and verification and verifying the information that we get. And then throughout the reporting, whenever we're going to publish about someone, then we reach each person for comment, which is the ultimate level of verification to see what they have to say. But we go through public records and on different ways. So one is to validate the data and like data quality assessment. And then the second part is to continue with the reporting. So we just cross-check against also court records, sanctions lists, land registries, contracts data, just to see what are the elements of public interest in our data, and then what would be the focus of our story, and how this topic can be explored in a systemic way. So we found how secrecy, was playing a big game, how elites were using, again, the offshore world to avoid, in some cases, taxes. In other cases, it was to buy real estate. In other cases, to create trusts. We explored new jurisdictions, for instance, the use of South Dakota. But it's all like that combination of public and public data and leaked data. So the leaked data is the beginning, and then we have to use a lot of public data. And then you have a lot of variations in the quality and level of access you have to that data. So in terms of even, we were lucky, and we had more than ever more beneficial ownership information than ever before because of a change of legislation. So BVI, after we published Panama Papers, says now providers need to basically report who are the beneficial owners of the company. So we got a lot of that information of those reports to the BVI authorities, but that information is not available to the public. If you go to the BVI corporate records, you're just going to find very basic information about the company name, creation date, and so on. And then you face many challenges. So our reporters always say, well, if you don't know who the people behind those companies are, sometimes many of these records don't allow you to search by person's name. So if you're a regular person and you want to say, is there any politician from my country connected to an offshore company in any of these jurisdictions? Unless you know the company name, you won't be able to find it because you can't search by person. And so on. There are many issues in terms of accessibility and variations in quality also in public records. But I would say that's the beginning, and I will let us continue with the conversation. But there's a lot of data mining and tools that we use for our research too, and then cross-check against public data.
And I was going to say, you've shed your light on some of the sources and some of the public databases that you were able to access. With the privacy laws and GDPR and all the new privacy laws that have come on stream, does that impede your investigation? Or is there much more open source public data than people actually think?
Well, I do think it's a combination, like not all, like GDPR is, for instance, or privacy law it's tied to a lot European data. You still find public data there, and we need to monitor how that ends up affecting the evolution of public records. Sometimes we have seen loss of historical data, which is a problem for research if you want to see how things evolve and change over time. Some of those records are not there. So that's something that we have experienced. But it's something that we need to monitor. I think there is a lot of public data around. The problem is it in the shape and format that we need for the research too? Like, do we have it downloadable? Can we download bulk data to explore a full database tied to contracts or ownership, et cetera, Still, like, a lot needs to happen on the ownership level. Like, ownership data is not available all around the world. We still need to, like, there have been some changes of regulations, but it's not available to the public. But there's still some interesting starting points, and we always go to public records to continue with our research. But it's how do you mine that data in a way that you can connect the dots. So not all the dots are connected when you're exploring public data.
Yeah. And you need to know your question in advance, really, don't you? You need to know what you're looking for. Otherwise, you go down all sorts of avenues that are very, very unhelpful. Well, look, it's an interactive session, and I just want to pause for a second because we actually have got a comment, and I think it sort of reflects some of the things that we talked about sort of higher up in the conversation before I ask a few more questions of the panelists. But we've a comment from one person who says, I live in the Philippines, and there's data that exposes government agencies' corruption during the pandemic. Analysts showed that a company without a track record and capacity was awarded billions of emergency contracts. Senate conducted an inquiry that the president argued for the company's benefit and even prevented its ministers from cooperating with the investigation. So here you have a case of data published, then used by a watchdog, but accountability is elusive and likely nothing will happen from this investigation. So I think that speaks to the point that we were saying that you could have voluminous amounts of data, but it's being able to take you to the next step and make it actionable data, if you like. Let me just put this point to you, Alina, in the first instance. What would you recommend governments do to help build capacity and to help address precisely this kind of, I suppose, data fatigue, if you like, that ordinary members of the public may fear, knowing that there's data there, but actually what's the point unless it changes things?
Well, I think that smart governments which are not entirely captured, because, I mean, let's be honest, if a government is entirely captured by people who just want to keep all the rents and not share anything, it's not in their best interest to share not even data, all right? So we're not speaking about those. But there is a mid-level category of governments, all right? Governments which are extracting some rents, but in the same time, they are facing competition. And they might lose office. So they want to keep what they have. They're going to eventually face elections. And I think that these governments are really, really wise to create themselves this kind of monitoring and integrate it into some sort of capacity building. I mean, there's very simple examples that we have for the private sector, but also from the public sector. Think that, if you are sharing a car, and you take a sixth car in the street and then you leave it back there, you are immediately going to get like some sort of an evaluation form, the same that you get on TripAdvisor when you travel or whatever, which was going to ask you to rank the service that you just received. Imagine that every service of government could have something like this. Everybody has smartphones. I return to my number one grounds of optimism. There is one green area which is expanding on the map, which is internet users and online services. So governments will have to increase, and they are increasing, the digitalization, and people actually also become increasingly users of this digitalization. And the simple thing to do is just incorporate this evaluation of good government, of the service that you get from the administration in everything you do. You have a username, whatever you do, let's say you pay taxes today, or let's say you use the municipal water service, right? You get the same kind of evaluation that you get in the private sector. In fact, I have seen this in my original country, which is Romania. They used to pay a lot of bribes for car registration and for passports. And today, the way it works is that, so there were queues, and in order to bypass queues, people were paying. Today, you just have to go in, log yourself electronically, schedule yourself. They even send your passport by mail, by secured mail using private mail. And there is this monitoring thing on top of the page, which says, we promise that the service is not going to last more than 14 days, but actually the score today is 8 days and a half. And of course, this increased the popularity of a lot of the governments who did this, because people remember only 10 years ago, you were paying bribes to get a passport, and today they're actually overperforming, and all this helped to digitalization. So I think there is a lot of, it's a win-win, okay? We cannot get into their big accounts. That is what the Pandora people are doing, yes. But in the normal day-to-day life, which matters for most people, I think that we can actually combine this kind of capacity building and measurement of what the government delivers with this kind of ratings by people if I was asked to bribe or not. This could simply be part of this evaluation tool. So how was today? Did you get what you wanted? Did you have to wait a lot? Did you have to pay a bribe? You just click from green to red. And, if government wants to do something and the service is notoriously bad, after 6 months, they can definitely replace the person in charge of that service, or they're going to lose elections.
Alina, with some of the platforms that you've set up to basically monitor corruption and to monitor procurement, have you had a chance to actually measure the public response to that, or is it too early days?
Well, no, it's not early days. I mean, I must say that, again, the differences of development that other speakers highlighted are very important, So from my small indicators of 7 years ago, one must realize that today we have something which is called European Single Market Scoreboard, where a public procurement scoreboard is included. And this public procurement scoreboard created by the European Commission in Brussels, it's actually taking up 2 of our indicators. Very simple, straightforward ones, as it should be: transparency of bids, if bids are public or not, and single bidding, if tenders are competitive or not. Now you can go on the website of the Commission and see this across EU 27, year by year. So you can see who's going up, who's going down. Now the question really is, why doesn't the European Commission tie this up with this new rule of law mechanism? Okay, because we're looking around for a mechanism to sanction deviant countries. I asked this question in the past 2 years a lot. The reason is that people are really, really reluctant to do this. And in fact, they argue that public procurement is in the realm of national sovereignty. And somehow, although we are actually speaking EU funds for Poland and Hungary, somehow we are reluctant to tackle it yet. But yes, it's out there. It's out there, and it should be very influential. Only it shows that even at EU level, this matter is politically sensitive. Not 27 member countries agree in the Council, and that's why you cannot do much. However, at smaller level, I have seen spectacular changes in my lifetime. I mean, I used to show 15 years ago, I used to show a slide which showed that before and after my country joining the European Union, you can see before, like these construction companies, of which some of them had 2-3 employees. You could not really find a physical place where their headquarters existed, but they won fabulous public contracts. So even in 2008, when the entire economy in Europe collapsed, and in Romania, the construction sector contracted, these companies had profit rate of 30-40%. Why? Because they were winning all the big public contracts. All right. And opposite to them, there were the big European construction companies, Strabag, American Bechtels, and whatever. And all of them were losing money, okay, because you just could not. You had all these domestic profiteers, politically connected, which won everything. But I can tell you that 10 years later, this doesn't look like this anymore. Most of those people who are these domestic companies are either bankrupt or in jail or eliminated. And you would have like the normal companies that you would expect, companies which prove themselves in various other countries, in various other environments. So how did this change? I just went around and showed these slides to all ambassadors of the other countries. Romania was in a common market, so would you expect market freedom? But of course, this is the very privileged landscape of the European Union. And I'm perfectly aware that that's not so easy to do on other continents, but maybe an equivalent exists. There are people who lose. The companies from these important countries like France, like Germany, like UK were losing. When I showed them that, they really mobilized themselves for level fielding business. And I think that, similar things can be done by activists. I mean, researchers should come up with this data. Activists should take them up and they should go to the losers. Somebody loses out of corruption. And losers will act once they have the evidence because it is in their best interest. It is always this alliance between people who are, altruistic, journalists or researchers, and people who have it in their best interest. It's only this alliance between egoists and altruists which changes something in corruption. It has to be a very broad alliance to move on.
Alina, you make a very compelling case. Thank you very much indeed. Delia Ferreira, can I put this to you? What role do you think international organizations could play in helping to make progress in using some of the tools that we've just heard to? And what about other stakeholders? Is there room for other stakeholders to be involved in this sphere?
Certainly there is, and as I have mentioned, international organizations fighting corruption are already using and sometimes our chapters, for instance, were the ones who first, in cooperation with tech persons, created the tools, and then we donate to the public officials in order to use it in the public sphere. So we can help in that, and we are doing that. But some questions are referring to the accessibility of information, and then what happened then, which has to do with what Alina had mentioned. And the fight against corruption is not only accessing information. That's only one element. Fight against corruption means information, integrity, no impunity, and that has to do with what's the result and consequences of having access to this information, and also to put an end to indifference or this fatigue, because if voters keep on voting for corrupt officials, even knowing and having access to all the data that we have now, for instance, in terms of COVID contracts abuse, well, that's another problem. So it is not, as Alina says, transparency is needed, but it is not enough to fight or eliminate corruption. And this brings me to an important point. Liz mentioned the need for data infrastructure. I would add that we need data and data analytics governance here, because we have to guarantee that ethics and integrity is embedded in the data analytics tools that we are using, and in the design and deployment of the famous artificial intelligence tools and algorithms. We need to guarantee that there is no bias, that there is no discrimination, either in the data used to train these new tools, because these new tools are trained on databases. If those databases used for the training of machine learning, of deep learning, if those databases are biased, outdated, discriminatory in any way, the algorithms will reproduce this kind of problem. So we need infrastructure, capacity building, but we also need data governance in order to be sure that we are not going into what I call algocracy, which is the governance by algorithms. Algorithms making decisions. That is very dangerous. Humans shall be at the steer of this data use or data analytics, because the data or data analytic tools are very useful, but they are not neutral. They can be used, and the use is key in this issue. They can be used for good or evil. They can be used to produce better public policies or better service delivery, but at the same time, these tools can be used for surveillance and shrinking or attacking the space for civil society, journalists, and so on. So we have to be careful that it is not magic. We have to do it in a rigorous way, as Elizabeth mentioned.
Spot on. And Delia, can I ask you another question that's related to that? Do you think that as with the evolution of data analytics tools, there is a possibility that some governments will actually start to securitize what were previously publicly available databases? I'll give you an example. There's a database in Kenya, which is a centralized government database where births, where other life events are all recorded. It's supposed to be run by the Ministry of Home Affairs, if my memory serves me correctly, but it has a large security dimension to it. Is there a danger that as governments get wise, if you like, to the fact that all these new these data tools are effectively putting them in check, that increasingly data that's currently in the public domain shifts under national security, and actually that space contracts? Or is that just inevitable, do you think?
They will try to do that. It is for activists and journalists and researchers to be watching that and to stop that move. But we have already seen that not only in the example you have just mentioned in Kenya, all around the world during COVID, we have seen even developed highly democratic or strong democratic countries that have put information in quarantine, not only people. So information has been one of the victims of COVID. COVID contracts has been out of the web pages because of urgency, rapid response, lots of good justifications, which in fact was aimed at not allowing proper and timely accountability on the huge amount of resources that were being spent. And a particular issue in terms of confidentiality and the lack of willingness or the willingness to go in a secret way was vaccines. Vaccines deals or contracts has been the most confidential contracts in the last 10 or 20 years. And they still remain that because of labs or pharma companies, but also because of governments. They didn't want to show the information, and they use excuses. And that's the problem. They can say, for market reason or commercial secrets, we cannot make the contracts open. But they are using public resources to buy vaccines or whatever they are buying. Because in many contracts that has been leaked, they are not buying vaccines, but the obligation on the company was to do the best they can. Not to give or hand doses, but to do the best to hand doses. So from the juridical point of view, it's a huge difference. So we as citizens have the right to know. Apart from that, vaccines are going to be inoculated on population. So we need to know. And governments are using many excuses to avoid giving us the information.
Well, that leads me nicely to a question I want to put to Liz, actually. If we're seeing the possibility of governments effectively securitizing data or clinging on to it, to put it in a more sort of colloquial way, is there a possibility of having something like a best practice guide? I mean, for example, the use of open data for evidence purposes, and say, for example, in international human rights cases, there's now a best practice guide. There's something called the Barclay Protocol, which is a best practice guide for prosecutors. Isn't there the possibility, or perhaps it already exists, of having something similar for governments that effectively gives them a rating, a star rating, if they are using data in a way that is seen as helpful to the electorate, and that is also sort of meeting some of the governance criteria that we've heard mentioned already in the discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that source of pressure from above, as well as what, we've talked a lot about pressure from below in terms of getting citizens to take notice of data and to hold governments to account. But there is this pressure from above often with international organizations, encouraging this best practice in data collection. And we've seen a lot of initiatives from the OECD, from UNODC, from the G20 around trying to think about what does good measurement look like, and also what does good data collection and publication look like. We've also got the fantastic Open Government Partnership, encouraging governments to be much more transparent. We've got Open Contracting Partnership, particularly pushing for transparency on public procurement data. So I think there are those standards emerging. But I think a tricky thing here is making sure that we're asking for the right things. So making sure that we're not over asking for things that are really not that relevant, as well as making sure that what we're asking for is something that is deliverable by all governments. So I think one of the tricky things in this area is that many of our traditional measures have been developed in the West, and there's a valid criticism that they've been developed in a way that overlooks the complicity of many Western actors in encouraging and facilitating forms of corruption, and also overlooks that kind of corruption that can happen in the making of laws and regulation, in lobbying, that again is often overlooked by many measures. So I think what is important going forward is when we're developing these best practice guides, we're really doing it in an inclusive way that thinks about all governments, thinks about the capacity issue, and thinks about what's really relevant and what's not. So we're not just piling on standards for the sake of it.
Liz, thank you. A question to Emilia. You're working in the investigative journalism field, and I'm wondering, given the fact that you're dependent on raw data effectively to be able to do your investigations, does it mean that states with greater amounts of data are more likely to be investigated and potentially really skews the global picture of where most of the corruption is happening?
Well, not really. We look at everything. And actually, our organization is quite global, and that talks about global efforts. I remember we did a project a few years ago on implants, medical implants, and actually we FOI'd, like we did freedom of information requests around the world. And basically, you can see what kind of data you can get across countries. That was on devices that were recalled because they were causing effects to patients, like sometimes harm, and injuries. And it was also tied to the approval processes. Totally different project from Pandora, but also connected to cost sometimes it can have to humans. And that we do also with our offshore projects. But the thing is, we do look at data across country levels. So we are interested in exploring topics systematically, not only at one country level, which takes us to the point that usually these efforts that are global, that aim for global transparency in terms of that forces governments across countries to try to open data, make it better. But sometimes when there is lack of data in one country, that doesn't mean that the data about that country is not there. And that actually, I've done it a lot when I was doing investigations, for instance, tied to Venezuela. Then you can find information tied to contractors or people who have contracts in the government in other parts of the world. So the fact that other countries are opening up data, that doesn't mean that that data is exclusively about people and individuals from that country. So, and what we have seen, for instance, in our offshore projects is that the money flows across countries. So actually you can find pieces of the puzzle if the data is open up in other parts of the world. And I do think there needs to be more global initiatives, and data needs to be publicly available all around the world. But the fact that one government opens up more data doesn't mean that that's the government that is going to be investigated the most. We look very carefully at how to explore topics at a systemic level and across countries. And fascinating how sometimes data in some parts of the world help investigate other parts of the world, at least with companies and contracts and things like that. So we need to be smart, and we try to develop ways in which how can we connect the dots across countries to investigate all different kind of countries and information tied that, because we want to see how systems affect, or systems that could be broken could affect citizens all around the world. So is it our victims, are people affected by it? And that is not, in our case, as we're an international organization, it's not as at a one specific country level, but at a global level.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I'm just wondering, a question that I'd like to put to Alina. Two parts of the question, actually. Are some of the open source data tools that you're using, are they applicable in low resource settings? Can they be scaled up in low resource settings? That's the first part to it. And the second part is, what role do you think there is for international organizations to help make more progress in the use of open source data tools for tackling corruption? You're on mute, Alina.
So thank you very much for this. Yes, data is fabulous, but in the same time, the most practical thing, to cite a physicist, a Nobel Prize laureate physicist, is to have a good theory. And if you have a good theory, you can collect some scarce data regardless the environment. It can be the absolutely poorest environment, okay? So for instance, good theory would tell us that there is no primacy of administration. This is actually, a citation from Max Weber as well as from Woodrow Wilson. There is no primacy of administration. There is no point in discussing corruption in administration title of our symposium today, except if you are in a very developed country where public-private separation has already historically happened. And those are very few countries, minorities of countries in the world. In the rest of the world, the solution to corruption in administration lies outside of the administration. What are the kind of indicators that you should monitor? Do you really need big data for this? No, you don't. Administration is very likely politicized, is a tool for whoever is the captor of the state. What you need to have is the turnover. You know, I mean, you can just take one agency and look, does every government who come replaces the hospital managers, for instance, okay? There's no reason for this to happen. Or the public procurement people who are in charge. Again, there's no reason for this to happen except that they want to exploit the rent in public procurement. If you are in a very poor country, you should monitor nepotism. If you are in a very developed country, you should monitor revolving doors, right? Because there are simply different mechanisms. In the first, you're not going to have public-private separation, so you're going to see these families in the administration. You know, we have very fun researches, you know, people who look on how at the court of Sweden, from a number of small families over 4 centuries, you had more and more diverse family names. Okay, the more merit grows and replaces this kind of family ties. You don't need data for this. Okay, you just need to observe your government to have sources to work as a journalist. All right. But this is, you know, as Liz said, that's quite important. The basic step in theory is to understand that corruption is 2 different animals in environments of systematic corruption, where corruption is norm, and in environment where corruption is an exception. It's bad enough everywhere, but tools are very different. The kind of data that we can observe are different. And the good news, if that is good news, is that in the kind of environment you refer to, corruption is not so hidden. You know, in systematic corrupt countries, there are also status societies. Kleptocrats love to have palaces. They love to have palaces in their native village for their fellow villagers to admire them, or they like to have flash cars. You know, so I've just seen a very innovative, fun measurement of somebody who just looked how many people in this country are applying for special license plate for their cars. Okay, and is the number going down following, because this country really had a crackdown, it's Greece, I can tell you, in the past 10 years. Is the number of people who put, you know, less value on these things going down or up? And unfortunately, it's not going down. While I can tell you that in a country, one of the very few genuine anti-corruption achievers of the past 20 years, a country like Uruguay, you know, go around in Montevideo and see how many Hummers or Mercedeses you count. There are very few. There are very few. So, you know, that's an indicator that everyone can see, and which is very orientative if what the culture is and if the culture is shifting.
It's a really good point. I have to say, I remember being taught by Bellingcat once that if someone is trying to hide their money, it's amazing how much people want to brag on social media if they've got a yacht or if they've got a flashy car, and it's very easy to track them down. Some really interesting comments that are coming through on the chat. We can't refer to them all at the moment, but we really do appreciate your engagement. Some of the issues have been touched upon by our panelists. I just wanted to raise one in particular. Someone talked about the Global Data Barometer, which is a critical new benchmark on country-level data governance, data capability, data availability, and data use for the public good. Now, that's due to be released by the end of 2021. If you have a look in the chat, there is a link there, but it also speaks to some of the points that I know Liz in particular were making. We are running out of time rapidly. Many of these issues are being discussed in the panels over the next few days, and some of the papers are touching on precisely the issues that we've looked at. But I'd like to have, as a final, just a couple of minutes, a quick whip round my panel to just give me your gut reaction just in a few sentences, whether by and large you are optimistic about the future of open data tools being able to assist in corruption investigations. Do you want to kick off, Liz?
Sure, thanks very much. Great question. I'm optimistic. Couple of reasons. I think that even if we do see more governments trying to control data, it's difficult and it's not possible for them to control it entirely. And my other point would be, for me, the most exciting thing in the last decade has been this development of transnational cooperation among investigative journalists. If you think back to a decade ago, we were all worried about the death of journalism with moving to online and how were newspapers going to make money. And then we were risking losing that important accountability function. And in fact, we've seen this completely grow up. It is a completely new funding model, but it's really deep, important investigative work.
Liz, thank you. Delia Ferreira, your thoughts? Optimistic?
Absolutely. I am optimistic. As Liz said, we have gone a long way before when we started. So we will keep on improving, I am sure, but we have to take into account also the risks and to be sure that tech is a tool, but not a magic solution to corruption. We have to keep on working on other aspects that has to do with the comprehensive fight against corruption, from independence of the judiciary to effective sanctions, etc. But I am optimistic. We have lots of things now available.
Thank you. Emilia, good for future investigations. I'm assuming you're optimistic.
Yeah, I'm optimistic, but at the same time, I think, as Delia points, there are some things that we need to keep in mind. When we have lots of data, we need to figure out how it connects to each other so that it actually, does it have unique identifiers across countries? Can the data talk to each other? What is the quality of this data? Because sometimes you have a lot of data around, but then how can you use the data? How can we understand the data? How can we analyze the data? So we need to have data that we can make sense of. So I'm very optimistic, but at the same time, we need to keep monitoring the quality of the data that we're getting and that it actually allows us to do the work, that it allows us to, have a bulk data to do analysis, that it allows us to connect across countries, and that it's not isolated islands with lots of volumes of data that we say, oh, we're fascinated about it, but what does it tell us?
Thank you. Alina, fewer places for corrupt individuals and corrupt governments to hide, given these new digital tools. You optimistic?
Well, let me put it like this. 10 years ago, when you looked at this, the figures, it really looked very well. I mean, if you knew internet usage, or if you knew number of household connections to internet, you could predict 2/3 of corruption. So, or if you knew how many people were associated through Facebook, number of Facebook users on a country. Okay, but I think that 10 years later, again, we have to be aware that we're not alone out there. I mean, I think that all this anti-vaccine propaganda that we have seen so successful in many countries also illustrates the problem that we face in corruption. Internet is not a whiteboard where only us, the integrity champions, right? But it's actually has become a very competitive field where people will have trouble to distinguish the truth from the fakes and the good guys from the bad guys. So yes, we have created that platform, but the bad guys have also learned, and it's all the more work for us there in the future, I think.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things that was raised in the chat was this concept of data fatigue, that publics may become so overwhelmed with the volumes of data that's around and being able to sift through what is genuine and what is not. Thank you very much indeed. It's been an all-female panel, which is quite interesting, actually, not by design, really by accident, but it's been wonderful talking to you all. We know that women in tech is a very important constituency. Thank you very much indeed. And I'd like to wish you every success over the next 4 days in your deliberations. This is a really interesting symposium. And thank you all very much indeed for your insights. Let me hand back over now to Jim Anderson.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen. Can I do a quick check and a wave to be sure everyone can hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so thank you very much, Karen, and to all the members of the panel. It was indeed a very interesting discussion, and as I knew it would be, and some good questions and comments in the chat feature as well. For those who are connected, please be sure to keep questions and comments coming. Before we get into the first panel to discuss the papers, I wanted to do a brief review of the agenda for the next 4 days. And this is partly to give you a sense of what's coming and the breadth of different types of topics that will be covered. So today we have 2 sessions, each one with 3 papers. First on new data-driven approaches to detect corruption, and second on measuring corruption in countries. Tomorrow we have two panels. One is on machine learning techniques and advanced data to detect corruption, and the other is on measuring corruption transnationally. And in addition, we have a number of sessions which are more presentation mode rather than discussing the new papers that came as part of the symposium. We'll hear about the procurement anti-corruption and transparency platform. We call that PROACT. We have a session on leveraging technology to improve the management of integrity risks, detecting patterns through data. And we also have a short, what we call a lightning talk, 15-minute style talk on digintegrity, how data and technology are leveraging integrity policies in Latin America. On the third day, on Wednesday, we have two panels to discuss the papers. One is on corruption in public administration, and the other on using new data sources and methods to measure the impact of corruption. Other sessions for that day are one we have on the power of public data, analytics to deter corruption, and the other is a presentation from the manager of our World Development Report 2021, which was called Data for Better Lives. We'll also have a lightning talk that day from the Data and Policy, on the Data and Policy Journal, which is a peer-reviewed open access journal dedicated to the impact of data science on policy and governance, and they're one of our partners here for the symposium. On the final day, on Thursday, we have two panels. One is on corruption in public procurement, and the other on politics and corruption, measuring corruption in political parties and elections. Another session that day will be on assessing laws and regulations to undo state capture. Finally, for our closing plenary, we're going to have a discussion on the future of data and anti-corruption, and this will involve a number of the chairs and discussants from throughout the symposium. The agenda, by the way, is posted on our events page. Please do check back. If we have any readjustment, you'll find it there. We don't expect there to be many, but there may be something. So now I'd like to move right on to the next panel. I'm the chair, so it's easy to make this transition. I'm happy to introduce our discussant, who I believe is connected online. Mihaly Fazekas of the Government Transparency Institute and one of our partners. He'll also be presenting the PROACT tool that I mentioned tomorrow, but today he's a discussant for the three interesting papers that we have for this session. The papers will be presented by David Szakonyi from George Washington University, Leena Hoffmann and Raj Patel from the Chatham House Africa Program and University of Pennsylvania, respectively, and Tomáš, Diviák, and Nicholas Lord from University of Manchester. We've asked the presenters to stay to about 15 minutes and to be sure to cover things like the methodology, data, findings, and insights. And we'll start right on with the first paper, which is called Smart Parser, an applied methodology for extracting and analyzing disclosure data in Russia. And David Szakonyi is here in the room with me, and so he can present.
Thank you very much, Jim. Delighted to be here to talk about some new research on income and asset disclosures in Russia. So, as the previous panel discussed at length, there's just been an incredible advances and synergies in anti-corruption investigations. We're all good, yeah. Around the world, but especially in the post-Soviet space over the last decade or so. There's a couple examples from some of the more high-profile work being done on high-level Russian officials, for example, by flying drones over their dachas. That's Medvedev in Ukraine, the former president's very luxurious palace, where anti-corruption investigators, after the events of the Maidan, were able to kind of reuse and salvage a lot of fascinating documents about how an autocratic regime operated and distributed corruption. So journalists and analysts and observers are really on the front lines and experimenting with incredible new methods to try to detect, analyze, and hopefully combat corruption among really high-level officials in countries around the world, but especially in the post-Soviet space, which we'll be talking about today. Beyond that kind of more kind of gumshoe type reporting, there's been an incredible outburst in forensic economics technology and academic work where using publicly available administrative data, a variety of scholars in a variety of countries have developed new methods for analyzing kind of before-after snapshots of politicians and other high-level officials to figure out what is the value of serving in office. And this table, as well as the paper, kind of presents an overview to show that this topic has garnered a lot of interest among economists and political scientists. And we know that in many, many different settings across many different time periods, there's a lot of money that can be made of serving in politics. And we know that in large part through what I call income and asset disclosures, which the bank has put in a ton of money and resources in order to developing a set of best practices and analyzing this anti-corruption reform to just kind of show that when you require politicians to self-report their income and assets, it's a really powerful anti-corruption monitoring tool, and we can derive really fascinating insights from this really kind of diverse and comprehensive and widespread source of data. So this paper that I'll be talking about is really about how to better use this really significant source of data and deploy it in maybe a little bit more creative and a little bit more rigorous fashion. These income and asset disclosures, according to a World Bank study from a couple of years ago, are actually among the most widespread, and I might argue the most widespread anti-corruption reform that we have worldwide. According to a report in 2017, 161 out of 175 countries, it's probably gone up since then, have some sort of rule in place that politicians declare their income and asset disclosures every single year. Now, this paper kind of starts with this motivation that that's great. The more data, the better in most respects, and this offers an incredible opportunity to observers and analysts to work with. That said, you're probably scratching your head being like, he's going to talk about Russia. How can we actually use income and asset disclosures from weakly institutionalized societies and trust the data that comes with that? And I'm going to agree with you that a lot of this reliance on these disclosures to detect corruption kind of assumes that this information is true and is genuine, and not as much work has been put in to validating and verifying the data to really say, is this a genuine source of information that we can use to build investigations? Part of that is because these disclosures really come from elected officials rather than appointed officials. We're getting a very specific cut or insight into this whole kind of political realm. And I think a lot of the papers that I talked about in the previous slides are really talking, actually all of them, about elected officials. But as more and more research comes out about the bureaucracy, how important that is, most politics is not electoral politics, and that the number of bureaucrats vastly outnumbers the number of elected politicians in just about every single country. And when we don't focus on them, we only focus on the high-flying stars of the national parliament or the executive, we lose a lot of insight into the bigger picture of corruption. So this paper, I'm going to kind of offer a solution that we've been developing over the last 3 or 4 years in the Russian Federation to improve the accessibility and the usability of income and asset disclosures. And specifically, I'm going to talk about a technological solution using a new set of computer programming insights to clean disclosures data and make it much more useful for journalists and academics and civil society activists. And surprisingly, I'm going to be talking about Russia over the last 10 years, which you might not associate with the most transparent or the most kind of high level of bureaucratic capacity when it comes to anti-corruption reform. That said, every year in Russia, over 2 million officials must submit annual disclosures on their income, assets, expenditures, bank accounts, stocks, real estate, and transportation. And surprisingly, about 10% of the 8-page form that they have to fill out every year is publicly disclosed on thousands of different websites across the Russian internet. That means that every single official, you can find basic information, such as their income, the cars and the makes and model that they have, and the number of apartments and houses and their square footage for every single official. It's just that this information is scattered across the web. In 2011, the Russia chapter of Transparency International began manually importing tens of thousands of these documents every single year into a database. And it is a headache, to kind of put it lightly. These documents are in different formats, like Word and Excel, PDF, RTF. They have different column structures. They have different coverages. They're manually entered by the officials and then manually scraped by this team at Transparency International. So we've got this incredibly rich source of data that is only being partially utilized because of the kind of technological hiccups that come along with it, maybe by design by the Russian government. They were doing this very transparent anti-corruption reform, but they introduced a couple of roadblocks around the way to make it difficult for researchers. Here's a snapshot of a form that's been translated in English, and you can see that for this council member of a municipal council in a small city in Russia, and her spouse and her dependent children, you know for 2015 their annual income in rubles, you know the apartments that they use, the square meters of the apartment. We don't know the address, but we know the country where they're in, and we know that her husband drives a Volkswagen Polo, and you'll be pleasantly or probably unpleasantly surprised by the variety of cars that Russian officials drive, but also the detail that we know about their Bentleys and Maseratis, as well as their Honda Civics and so forth. So this data, this snapshot right here, is available for over 2 million public officials every single year, beginning in April and May, and then it carries over into the next year. What we've done is develop what we call Smart Parser, which is a multi-step package that's on GitHub. You can go see all the open source for the code to solve this problem. So to put it lightly, we have thousands of documents in thousands of different formats across thousands of different websites, and we want to bring them together in one centrally located, centrally accessible, searchable database for anybody to use and potentially anybody to download and analyze themselves. So what the paper does is kind of walk through a couple of the innovations that this approach offers in a way that we hope is replicable for a lot of other country settings that have this big mass of data but haven't converted it into something that's actually more workable. And I think I'm going to highlight two of the different steps that I think are the most interesting. As I mentioned, there was the Volkswagen Polo in in the disclosure that I just showed. We've built a dictionary of all cars that have been produced in the world over the last 20 years, or 30 years more likely, and their make and their model, their year of production, the first year of production, and the country of production. We're talking about 28,000 different make and model combinations that we've needed to extract the data from the disclosures and standardize it so we can see what is the total value of the cars. And I'll talk a little bit about corruption measures when I get there. We also have come up with a standardized JSON format. We hope will be kind of a model for other countries as we share data across different settings to say this income, this car, and this car is comparable across two officials that are serving in a similar position. And in this country, it seems like it's more advantageous to run for office because of the way that the data is actually comparable across settings. So because of this technological solution we've invested a lot of time and money on, we've been able to parse 282,000 different documents, which means that about 5 million different individual official years can be parsed in about a day and a half. That's how quickly the tool works, and immediately can be converted into an accessible online JSON dump, as well as to the public, where you can search any official that's included, which is we think about 1/3 or 40% of the total officials right now. We have some coverage for them over the last 10 years, and there's a lot more work to be done as we develop the tool. But right now we're at an 82% success rate. I can talk about what that actually means in terms of correctly extracting the data and converting it into something that we're reasonably confident about. Confident enough that we'd use it in an investigation or a journalistic publication, that we could put it in there and say, look, you can trust this. You want to kind of refer to the original documentation if you're going to publish on it, but this is enough confidence to actually go with it and do something with. Now, all that said, we can create this beautiful database of over 2 million officials, but it might be all false. They might be lying about what's on their forms, or they might be hiding things, might be misrepresenting. I'll talk really briefly here about some new methods that we're trying to develop in order to find the corrupt and the bad apples within Russian officialdom. And the first one is to say, there's a red flag that's very obvious if you drive a car that's more expensive than your income. And in Russia, for example, you need to register your car to get your driver's license. And if you don't register your car, you're in a lot of trouble with the traffic cops. So there's this incentive to be honest in some sense about the cars that you own. And there's less validation about the income that you're reporting. Now, this isn't perfect in any sense, but what we've done is we've accessed and extracted car valuations for every single car that we have in our database. And for the Russian Duma, for example, we've analyzed all the make-model combinations, and we've created a simple ratio, which is what is the value of all the cars that officials and their families drive every year, and divided by their income. So how much money are they making? Obviously, the cars are not going to be your total income, but if that ratio is really far off, it's a real big red flag for officials. So I'll give you an example. Here's a deputy who's served in a couple convocations. He's declared no fewer than 8 cars every single year, including that really nice Infinity on your screen. But his annual income is only $50,000. So his cars and every year are worth 6 times the amount of income that he reports for his entire family. So this is an extreme example, an outlier, but that ratio can be used and leveraged in order to say which officials are more corrupt versus which ones are less. How am I doing on time? I'm almost done. And then finally, we're thinking about cross-validation. So if we can't extract all of the corruption measures from the data itself, we need to compare it to external ones. And a big one is through insurance declarations and other types of car registries to say, are they telling the truth? And to use that measure of kind of honesty in order to predict which officials are corrupt, so we can map where the corruption is in the Russian government, but also the consequences of corruption for different types of policy outcomes. So just to wrap up real quick, I think the paper offers, we think, a number of different insights for how to tackle a project of this scale, how to make it reproducible and transparent, but also how to make it useful for other different country settings. And the code blocks might be important for countries that have this massive data but don't know what to do with it. I think the final point is that it's really expensive to do this, and a lot of donors are either unable or not interested in working with Russia. So one of our big challenges is not to commercialize it, but to find other private sector actors that are interested in the data and sell it to them, so to fund the public benefit aspect of the project. Otherwise, it becomes completely unsustainable, and we're not going to be able to do this on an annual basis for the next decade. So kind of thinking creatively about how do we make sure that there's a subsidy type element to this so the work can go on and we're not so donor dependent, because in Russia, for example, there's just not a lot of donor funds being put to this type of anti-corruption work. So I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the long-term vision of this project because it requires a fair amount of resources, but it's not something necessarily that there's a lot of resources available to fund. So thank you very much and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, David. Next, we'll go through all the papers one after another, and then get to the discussant and discussion. So next, we have new data-driven approaches to measuring corruption drivers and addressing collective action problems. Presenters are Leena Hoffmann and Raj Patel, who will be presenting
thank
from
you very
Zoom. Thanks.
Hi, Jim. Thank you very much. Just be great to know if you can see my screen. I'm sharing a PowerPoint slide. I see someone nodding, yes. So excellent. So perfect. So thank you very much for having me on this particular symposium. It's really nice to be here and to have this opportunity to share our work on bribery behavior, pluralistic ignorance, and collective action. So we've just been in Russia, so I will bring you to Nigeria. The presentation I'll be doing this morning, afternoon, evening is part of a joint project with a consortium that includes partners at the University of Pennsylvania and as well as Nigeria's National Bureau of Statistics. And we have many other partners that we're working with, and they're listed at the end of my presentation. See if I can move forward. So it's a bit slow. So one of the main things I would like to do this today is to discuss, first of all, as Jim said, our methods and highlight some of the findings, specifically findings from our research that show that a lot of people tend to be routinely mistaken about what other people believe about bribe-giving behavior and how we think this has implications for collective action. So we highlight this evidence, and I think it's really kind of fitting into a lot of the conversations we've had and the session before, because in contexts like Nigeria, where bribery solicitation and giving is quite frequently observed, we think that these have implications for stimulating or coordinating anti-bribery collective action. Because if you think about it, already a difficult task is made even more so when more citizens think that other citizens or fellow citizens approve of bribery behavior. So in terms of our methods, we use social norms methodology, and this is kind of a breakdown of the basic components that you would find in our survey instruments, what our diagnostic tool will be looking at. So we typically test for the behavior, the frequency of the behavior, so whether people are engaging in that particular practice. Then we test for factual beliefs. So we want to know what people think is going on, do they think is legal, and so on. And then we test for personal normative beliefs. So what do people believe about the behavior, and why do they believe this? Then in our instruments, we test for social expectations, so empirical and normative. So we want to know if people think that other people engage in the behavior, and do people think other people approve or disapprove of the behavior? So we want to know how people perceive, how people understand the behavior, and what they expect other people to do in similar circumstances. So we go on to test for conditionality. And in this, we want to find out if people prefer to engage in the behavior because other people do and expect them to. And then finally, we want to identify the reasons that inform people's beliefs. So whether these reasons are practical or moral, or contextual in other ways, for example, due to underfunded institutions, the case with many public or social services. So how does this approach translate? So it translates into survey questionnaires that look something like this, with questions framed in this manner, with this type of language. And in this case, we were testing for bribery behavior related to vote markets, and specifically vote seller behavior. And what we typically ask is, out of 10 people in your community, comment on what people think people do or should do. So we incentivize a vignette scenario and then pose this question to the respondent. The next example I'll show you is of varying empirical and normative expectations. So we want to measure conditionality of corruption reporting. And this was in the context of embezzlement behavior. And I think maybe the part of the question to pay attention to is the almost all very few, and almost all very few. And using the CAPI system, we randomize, so there's an equal amount of a chance of people getting either or. So we want to vary between empirical expectation, normative expectation, empirical, normative, empirical, and so on. So there's 4 options in that context. So the reason why we test different aspects and vary expectations in this kind of way is because we want to unbundle the qualities of corruption. I think it skipped forward. Sorry, my device is a bit slow. My desktop is a bit slow. So I think, all right, so we want to vary behavior or vary the expectations that we're testing for in this kind of way, is because we want to unbundle the qualities of corruption, not focusing on the quantities. And it's very much our approach very much aligns with Yuanyuan Ng's index of unbundling corruption, which she developed. And she also employs a stylized vignette approach in her typology. We also use a vignette approach, but I think the difference between her unbundled corruption index and ours is that she's measuring perceptions in ours. We use ours to measure expectations. So while we agree that perceptions matter, we think expectations really matter in understanding corrupt behavior. My PowerPoint is skipping forward all by itself now. So examples of pluralistic ignorance, which is kind of what we track, we see quite tracking alongside bribery behavior, abound in both social and psychological literature. And what our study attempts to do, and the paper that we put forward for the collection, highlights is how much of a social phenomenon pluralistic ignorance is, and how much it relates or connects or tracks very closely to bribery behavior. And I'll explain that quickly in our findings now. Apologies, okay. So we administered an expectation-based survey in Nigeria in 2016 and 2018. These are some of the states that we looked at. We covered 800 households in each of the sites that we administered the expectation-based survey, urban, rural, a total of 5,600 households, very demographically diverse areas. But then even with that, we were able to draw out some local specificities that I will highlight shortly. We tested bribery behavior in 3 critical settings: law enforcement and healthcare in 2016. And then we added on education, specifically petty bribery in schools in 2018, so 2016 and then 2018. And we found that in all 3 of these contexts, people were systematically mistaken about what others in their community thought of bribery behavior. And I'll give you an example, a couple of examples. So in the 2016 survey, we found that less than 20%, so sometimes around 5% of people, thought that law enforcement officers should ask for an informal payment from a roads user for a traffic violation. Also, most people in the high 90s thought that it was wrong and illegal for law enforcement officers to ask for informal payments. Yet, when we asked people about the beliefs of others in their community, this is where it gets interesting. So their personal normative beliefs. And when you look at Adamawa State there, Rivers and Enugu, people there were systematically mistaken about what others in their community believed. So respondents thought that 40% of people, that's 4 out of 5 people, and thought that officers should ask for bribes for a roadside user. And this, of course, contrasts quite sharply with the previous slide that I showed you. People overwhelmingly thought it was unacceptable for officers to solicit bribes. And you can already begin to see how these kinds of mistaken beliefs have a sticking effect for galvanizing collective action. It's as though someone else is skipping my slides. I apologize for that. So, so when we turn our attention to, just a moment. So the healthcare setting, when we turn to bribery behavior for accessing a bed in a government-funded hospital, we found that respondents had quite different beliefs about bribery in this context compared with the traffic law enforcement context. While again, most people that were surveyed knew it was illegal for a healthcare worker on state payroll to ask for an informal payment, most people thought that workers should ask for this payment, and few thought that this behavior was inherently wrong. In some states, people thought that other people would think it was wrong, even though most respondents thought bribery solicitation could be rationalized in this particular kind of context. So we find that in this context again, and I'll try and just skip forward just one. We find that in this context, people again were mistaken about what others in their community believed. But what is most interesting about the healthcare setting, and you can find this information or this data in our microsite, is that people had held different beliefs towards healthcare bribery as opposed to law enforcement bribery. And we suspect that when you compare the expectations in these 2 different contexts, people thought about bribery having a different function in both contexts. So in the traffic enforcement context, bribery was seen as primarily extortionate. But in the healthcare context, it was more or less a more mutual functionality in that context. And finally, just findings on petty bribery in schools. When we looked at petty bribery in schools, the slide isn't changing just yet. We found that over 87% of respondents thought that parents should pay pass-mark bribes against 8% who were in favor. So this means that a large majority of respondents held negative personal normative beliefs about this bribery behavior. So they considered it unacceptable, even though it might be commonplace. And finally, when we looked at petty bribe, and finally, when we looked at the empirical expectations people had, we found as well that in most communities, respondents thought that a significant number of people supported pass-mark bribery, even though, you know, as we saw in the last slide, most people thought it was unacceptable, disapproved of that behavior personally. And again, you can see in Adamawa, Enugu, and Lagos, people thought that 4 out of 10 people gave bribes for their children or their wards to get a pass in an exam. So what we see quite frequently tracking bribery behavior is the nature of beliefs that people have about others. And it's this phenomenon of pluralistic ignorance coming through. And members of a community being in a position where they think a practice is more acceptable than it really is, because they all rightly observe it as common in their communities. And also this is despite the fact that, this came through in our qualitative, in our interviews afterwards, that communities disapproved of these practices, and would prefer them to stop. So just some quick conclusions on that and implications. So there are a few things that our findings confirm, that where bribe giving is prevalent, pluralistic ignorance is also likely to be prevalent. Additionally, where bribery is driven by empirical expectations or descriptive norms, and this is in the literature quite well confirmed, descriptive norms can often gain the upper hand and override injunctive norms, so what people think people should or shouldn't do. And to conclude, tools that help us measure and disaggregate beliefs and expectations in this way can help us understand corruption better, especially when it presents as a social trap, when it's systemic in the kinds of ways that we looked at and in the context of Nigeria. So by way of a conclusion, in our paper, we note that galvanizing collective action is limited when people mistakenly think that other people find a behavior acceptable. So even if it is in the best interest of most people to act collectively against bribery and in keeping with their personal normative beliefs, there's little perceived incentive to do so. And measurements such as ours using vignettes can serve as an important tool to qualifying and locating collective action blocks and sinkholes, as well as help us in designing informational campaigns, for example, that use social norms messaging to dispel pluralistic ignorance. We're also able to track where people are, how people are updating their beliefs, and as well design more context-specific, locally relevant approaches. So just finally, that's just a list of our partners in Nigeria. And if you'd like to learn more about our work, you can check out the SNAG site. Thank you very much for your attention. And apologies for the PowerPoint skipping so much. I don't know if Jim, sorry, your sound is gone.
I didn't hear anything, so I'm not sure whether it's my turn to speak. But
we hear you, Tomáš.
Can you hear me now?
We hear you, Jim, now. Thank you.
Okay. It seems rather random So I'll repeat. Thank you, Leena, for the interesting presentation. Moving on to the next one, conspiracy to corrupt, extraction and analysis of bribery network data from deferred prosecution agreements. And we have Tomáš Diviák, I think, will kick off this presentation. Thank you.
All right, so let me first share my screen. There we go. Could you just please nod your heads that you can see my screen and hear me quite well? Thank you very much. All right. Can you still see my screen? Because this, what I see is not my screen, most definitely. Lessons learned is not my screen.
So you need to share through the Zoom.
Yeah, I did that and then it sort of went off. So this should be it, right?
Okay. Now,
yeah.
now
all right. Now let me go full screen as well. Just a second. All right, so thanks a lot, Jim, for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here and very happy that I can share very fresh results actually from our research that we'll be working on together with Nick Claude, who's my colleague at the Department of Criminology at the University of Manchester. And the research that we've been working on is about using deferred prosecution agreements to extract and analyze corruption network data. Now, first of all, if you look at some of the most common definitions of corruption, they usually sort of entail things like that corruption can be defined as the abuse of public power for private gain. And these definitions usually do not really entail any explicit mentions of any interactional or any relational elements of corruption. However, if you look deeper into the specific forms corruption can take, such as bribery, favor exchange, or kickback, you'll see that they are actually intrinsically relational and interactional. What I mean by that is that when someone bribes someone else or when two actors exchange favors and so on, it's specifically embedded within the involved actors interacting with one another or doing so on the basis of the relations that they have. And this is perhaps even more salient in grant corruption, where we usually see multiple actors actually coming together and organizing themselves, collaborating, communicating about how to manipulate contracts, how to conceal their activities, and so on. And all these relations and interactions actually give rise to a network structure. What I mean by a network structure in this presentation is, in very abstract terms, this. So it's a collection of nodes and ties or edges among them, which is a sort of common canonical definition in social network analysis. Specifically for corruption networks, these nodes usually represent corrupt actors, so actors who are actually actively involved in corruption, and the ties or the edges represent the various interactions and relations among them. And of course, if we have the data about these networks, we can then use the whole sort of toolbox of social network analysis to map and model these network structures. And this, of course, gives us a lot of advantages, such as that we can actually empirically study the way corruption is being done. And we can also use the knowledge gained from the analysis of the data to design intervention and prevention measures. But of course, it's not that simple, because in all the actors involved in corruption networks, quite similarly to actors involved in other covert and criminal networks, usually aim to keep their activities concealed. They aim to avoid detection from law enforcement, whistleblowers, and so on. And this poses a difficulty for data collection. We try to circumvent the difficulty or the paucity of available data by using deferred prosecution agreements as a data source for constructing corruption networks. Now, deferred prosecution agreements themselves are legal tools how to basically elicit a voluntary agreement between prosecutor and a corporation that is somehow implicated in corruption, bribery, and so on. As a part of the deferred prosecution agreements, though, there are documents that are called statements of facts that, as the name suggests, state the relevant facts that are related to the events or to the events that happened, that transpired as a part of each case of corruption. Now, these statements of facts are textual summaries. So it's a long textual sort of record that documents who was involved, with whom they were involved, and what they committed together. And this sort of information of who, with whom, and what, and possibly perhaps even when, is actually the basis for extracting the relational data from these textual documents. Now, as you can probably imagine, the data, the network data, is not just readily made available in the form of the graphs or the adjacency matrices in the statements of facts. So we actually need to construct that using content analysis from the text. Unlike the usual applications of content analysis, though, this is a little bit complicated by two facts. First of all, there are no pre-specified units to code in terms of the networks. And what we want to code is something referred to as latent content, which means that the actors, but specifically and more importantly, the ties that they have, are not explicitly sort of listed or mentioned in the text, but they need to be extracted by close reading the files, really. And this then begs the question how to do so in a reproducible, valid, and reliable manner. Well, our procedure, how we want to sort of get to a reliable representation of a network in each of the cases that we look at, is as follows. First of all, we start with establishing the node set. That is the set of all actors involved in corruption that we have some knowledge or some indication that they were involved in that particular statements of facts. And this is sort of the anchor, because given the established node set, we then carry on with the data extraction in the subsequent steps. In the second step, we then take all the nodes, all the actors, and we extract information about their attributes. That is, we basically create a data set that describes their individual level variables. So things like their gender, their affiliation to organization, whether they are involved in public or private sector, and so on. And the third step is where we actually construct the networks, because in the third step, we extract the ties, the interactions and relations between all the people. And this then allows us to basically build a combined data set of attributes and edges. How it looks like in practice. So here on the screen, you see a quote from one of the statements of facts. It's basically just a piece of text. And those parts that are highlighted in yellow are those that somehow capture either an information about some actors' attributes, so individual traits, or the highlighted parts somehow capture the interactions and relations. And this can be translated into two data sets that we then combine together. The left-hand side data set is an attribute list. And that's something that's, that's a data format that's actually quite common in most quantitative research, because in the rows, you have the rows represent individual actors, and the columns represent the variables that describe the individual attributes of those actors. So for instance, for the ASL agent 1, you see that that actor was actually involved with both ASL and Lufthansa in this case. The second, a little bit less common data format that we use is the edge list. And this is one of the main data formats used in social network analysis to store the information about the edges or about the relations. And there, each row represents a single specific tie with the two parties, the two actors who sort of constitute the tie or between whom the tie is, and then also some other attributes that then describe the properties of the ties. And if you then do this analysis for the entire statement of facts, you can actually construct a network out of this. Now, of course, doing this close reading type of extraction of data from the data source sort of inherently comes with an element of subjectivity. And in order to somehow account for that, what we did is that as a part of the project, we used two independent coders to do this whole procedure on their own separately, independently. And then we assessed the reliability of their coding. For assessing the reliability of how they coded the attributes, we just calculated the matching index. So this is actually something that's quite usual in general content analysis. We just looked at the percentage of the actors that were sort of coded in agreement by both the coders. For assessing the reliability of coding ties, this is a little bit different, a little bit more complicated, because there is no clear one-to-one mapping of ties between the two coders. And so what we instead did was that we basically just let the coders, each of the coders, to construct a network, and then looked at the resulting network structures based on the coding of the two coders and compare their structures using graph correlations. Now, that may appear to be a little bit abstract. So a specific example, I'm still sort of continuing with the example that I introduced above. So here you see the two networks constructed by each coders. And as you can already visually see, the codings by the two coders are very, very similar, with perhaps one exception being that one of the coders did not code the tie between ASL senior employee 6 and ASL senior employee 3. But overall, the network representations are very similar, and that's also sort of supported by calculating the graph correlation. So we took the underlying adjacency matrices and calculated their graph correlations, and that yields a value of 0.98, which is a very, very high correlation between the two resulting network structures. We did this procedure for all the 5 networks, or for all the 5 cases that we had at our disposal. And as you can see, for the 5 cases, there's some variability in terms of how big or what is the size of those networks, because they range from the smallest case, just 5 actors, to the largest case where there were 36 active actors involved. The graph correlations are in the bottom line in this table. And as you can see, they are all actually quite high, perhaps with the exception of the largest case where the reliability is 0.82. So the coding of the relational information, so the coding of the ties, is quite similar between and quite reliable between the two coders. In terms of the individual attributes, we look at gender, organization, that is the affiliation each has in the case, and whether the actor is involved in public or private sector. And you can see 2 interesting things there. The first one is that whenever there's enough information available about the individual attributes, it's quite easy for the coders to actually reliably assess the individual attributes. However, and this is especially apparent in the case of gender, which may be a little bit surprising, but I think it's quite logical, and we can come back to that in the discussion. When we looked at gender, it's actually quite interesting in that, with the exception of the smallest case, the networks that we looked at, or the statements of fact that we looked at, were sometimes very, very sparse in terms of the information they contained with regard to the actor's gender. And so in 2 of the cases, it was even meaningless to calculate any coder agreement because there were more missing information than non-missing information. So overall, to sum things up, the coding of ties in our approach yields quite reliable results, and also the coding of attributes turns out to be quite reliable, with those exceptions where, and that relates mainly to gender, where we just don't have the information, and we have a lot of missing information. Now, of course, the work that I've presented here is by no means definite. There's further work to be done, and there are two sort of immediate avenues for further research. The one is investigating network dynamics, so actually looking at the ties and trying to give them specific timestamps so that we can actually see how these corrupt cases evolve over time. And the second avenue for future research may be using so-called multi-level networks to actually include non-human actors in the network representations, such as the firms. For future research per se, it may also be interesting to mention what can be done with this data. And actually, I should perhaps say parallelist research, because we're already doing some of it as we speak. And that, of course, entails analysis of these extracted networks. So actually doing substantive research, testing theories on this data, but also developing new methods for extending current methods and models in network analysis to handle this specific type of data. And lastly, of course, using the insights that we have from the data for designing prevention and intervention methods. But of course, this is not only a question of data, but also of a healthy dose of scientific skepticism, I would say. So that would be all my part. So thank you for your attention. If you're interested in learning more about the project, feel free to check out my website. I will shortly, hopefully by the end of this week, add more information about the project. I'll be looking forward for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tomáš, for the interesting presentation. Now we'll turn to our discussant, Mihaly. I didn't give too much instruction. There are 3 papers here, so it's not an easy thing to be a discussant for 3 papers. But let's hear what Mihaly has to say, and then hopefully there'll be a few minutes for some Q&A. We have some questions that have come through the chat and comments as well. But over to you, Mihaly.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jim. And I promise to be brief. I don't even have slides. I really want to give the floor to the discussion from the audience. And it's great to see this large number of people. I also would like to thank Jim and the organizers to having put me on a measurement panel. Year after year, I keep on finding myself on various corruption measurement and data panels, which are quite geeky thing, right? So probably I have to draw conclusions from this. Nevertheless, I have been working hard, and I'm very happy to see our partners in crime trying to make data and measurement sexy, trying to make it attractive, because it's crucial, and we need people to work on it. And I'm in particular grateful for David to show a fancy car, to demonstrate a measurement point or nice network figures. We need a lot of this. And a little bit more, seriously, I wanted to congratulate all 3 sets of authors, because while they presented very different things, they do a great job on discussing measuring corruption. And I would like to remind us of how far we have traveled as a community. If we had this panel 10 or maybe 15 years ago, the majority of the papers would have been some cross-country rehash or reuse of the ICIJ or some other, the International Risk Guide, or some sort of a subjective measure, perception-based measure of corruption. We have left that behind largely. And not to say that those papers or those metrics are not useful. They are useful, and they have been useful. But now we are a lot closer to action. And by action, I mean microdata. If it's bribery, you want to ask people about what they think about bribery. If it's about enriching illegally in the Russian Federation. We asked about how asset declarations reflect that, so on and so forth. So I think this is the right direction. So I'm grateful for this panel and grateful for the panelists to mention, to bring forward their arguments and their thorough research. Now, looking across the three papers, and then I really just drop one or two questions to each specifically. So looking across, I think it's great to see the diversity of corruption types they look at. High-level corruption, members of the Numa or top bureaucrats versus low-level bribery in Nigeria. And this is very important because once we deconstruct this big bucket of corruption and start to talk about specific types, specific sectors, specific corrupt interactions, this is where we can see the power of data. This is where we can build specific theories and interventions which rely on well-tested evidence. The papers also come from many very different countries, like Russia and Nigeria, I assume the UK, Tomáš's example. And they also use big data as well as small data. So big data having millions of sections in these asset declarations, small data having 5 or 7 well-researched, well-documented examples from deferred prosecution agreements. So that's, again, something I very much like, and I very much would like to encourage the authors to continue along this diversity and target with specific approaches they take. Now, the final general point I wanted to make is that I was impressed how much the authors put emphasis on establishing validity of measurement as well as reliability of measurement. And without starting an introduction to statistics class here, really just underline the importance of these two concepts. So when we talk about validity, we have to understand and we have to convince our data users that what we are measuring is really reasonably close or as close as possible to a theoretical concept we want to measure. So once you put out a corruption definition, we want to approximate that with our empirical measurement concept. And it's no easy business, right? We can argue around how close these two are, the theoretical concept and the measurement concept. We can look at convergent validity. This is an important term, where someone else has measured that kind of corrupt phenomena for which we are proposing a new measurement. So we expect a correlation between the two. Turning to reliability, I think Tomáš was excellent in pointing out how important it is to repeatedly measure the same thing. Repeatedly measure the same thing to establish reliability of our measurement, to establish how far off we are from the true value when we try to measure the same thing in repeated memory. And that's important because if there is ambiguity about a score, we all take the same scoring scheme, but different scorers give different numbers, then that opens up not just room for measurement error, but also for political pressure on the numbers we are producing. So we do need to take measurement reliability as well as measurement validity seriously. So that's the general points, and really just a few particular points on the three papers, taking the order they presented at. So David's paper is excellent as usual, so would like to congratulate him, and obviously this is a very important point. Some might not know about him, but he is also a member of ACDC, so that's not the band, but the Anticorruption Data Collective, and very nicely this work fits into their work, and I would like to invite others to look at the great work they are doing. Now, on the questions side of things, so it's a lot of steps, and David did a good job in walking us through the main steps. But there's a lot under the hood, right? So some bits and pieces use machine learning, Some bits and pieces use tailored dictionaries of asset classes, what have you. And then also there is a great deal of manual checks, especially the most important asset declarations, most important to be sure. So the question is sustainability, and I think it was touched upon, but that's an important point. How do we keep on feeding these and updating this? And being someone who's trying to keep running a large machinery of data collection, that is no easy business. Governments change their websites, their publication standards, laws change, and so on and so forth. So really sustaining this effort is no easy business. So having some comments on how economies of scale kick in or not as we go forward in time, that would be very great. And then also learning a little bit about what you think about transferability, right? So we have a Russian case. It's a particular alphabet, a particular language, a particular legal framework, so on and so forth. So to what degree could we take your code and say, well, I want to do the same thing in Brazil. I want to do the same thing in South Africa. How far would be from deploying it right away, and how much we would have to start from scratch. Going on to the second paper on bribery surveys. So this is a very different kind of business. My only question, and again, would like to repeat how grateful I was to read this paper and listen to the presentation. So my only question is, if you want to use that sort of analysis and want to use that for developing anti-corruption policies, what's the directionality of impact or effects here? So is it that people rationalize, expose their own corrupt behavior, saying, look, others are doing it as well. But it's an exposed rationalization because at the first place, they do it because it pays for them. It's easier to get away with speeding if you just bribe a policeman rather than having your driving license taken away. Because if that's the problem, then your solution would be, make corruption not pay to those who bribe the officials. However, if it's the opposite way, people think that others are paying bribes, hence they also more likely to pay bribes. Then it's more about running an information campaign and convincing people that actually a lot fewer people are bribing than what they think. So that's, I think, is a very important point. And as with a lot of bribery surveys, I think bribery does also solve practical problems on the ground, especially if governance arrangements and structures don't deliver. So that's a particular problematic thing. And finally, just one question to Tomáš, and very much looking forward to the analysis to bear fruit, and would like to hear your reflections on generalizability of these cases, how specific they are, how you could build theories on them and confidently claim that those insights apply to other cases. So what could be the domain of these other cases that we would be confident generalizing to? Thank you very much. Again, well done to all people.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mishi. A lot of very good points and good questions as well. Let me turn back to the paper presenters, and we'll go in the same order that we heard the papers. So starting with David. You could do either one. You just have to turn the mic. Push the button.
Can people hear me? Yeah, great. Well, thanks, Mishi, so much for the comments. Yeah, you raised some really good points. Sustainability is a really difficult issue, and it's hard even to discuss sustainability considering how many problems we had even getting off the ground and finding like the initial set of resources to fund the project, which has basically been bootstrapped up to this point. I think in terms of maintaining, the hope is that governments step up and make things easier. Now, I don't have that much faith that the Russian government will solve many of these problems for us, but it's in their advantage to make this as electronic as possible and to remove some of this kind of like dispersed documentation and structures, and it's inevitable, I think, that they're going to move away from this format. So in some sense, my hope is that as long as we can keep up for the next 3 or 5 years, there's promise that we're going to be moving to a different kind of mode. But otherwise, what we found is that there is demand for this type of PEP database. And I know of at least 2 or 3 international projects that are trying to build a PEP database and to compete with some of the financial institutions and to make it more accessible to the general public. So I think part of the sustainability effort is not just how do you monetize, quote unquote, the Russian data, but how do you build a PEP database worldwide with lots of different countries that can contribute to something that's really attractive for a financial institution or a business to tap in once, and then everybody gets a cut in exchange for the type of data that they contribute in order to keep running their domestic projects. And I know that there's some work being done on collaborating, especially out of Europe, and building that type of infrastructure. But I think that's the only way forward, is to kind of join efforts in the same way that journalists have, but in the income and disclosure thing, to make sure that everybody's contributing to a public good, but there are some subsidies that are coming out of that to fund it. For transferability, this is really specific to the Russian context. I fully admit that. We've built it for that very purpose. That said, we don't really, at this point, even have a standardized JSON format for income and asset disclosures worldwide. And I think what we're trying to do is contribute maybe a building block to that and start the conversation about what are other people's data structures like, what are they doing with their data, and is there something that we can do to map out all of the different inputs to get to that end goal, which is an international, fully universal income and asset disclosures. And whatever we can contribute, whatever lessons learned, I think even if they're very specific to the Russian context, can get us closer to that finish line. So thanks so much for the comments, and hope to see you soon in person.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for the responses. Let me turn now to Leena.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Mihaly, for the questions. Yeah, so the work that, like I said in the beginning, we've been doing this project, the Social Norms and Accountable Governance project, for about 5 years now. It is, at the time we started, it was quite new to be applying this type of methodology to studying corruption. So the methodologies around social norms and measuring social expectations kind of are more commonly used for kind of health and sanitation behavior. I think it's been used around other kind of social problems like child marriage and so on. So this is quite a new approach, or it's gaining quite a lot of interest across in the research corruption studies space. We've kind of been really trying to disaggregate the kinds of motivations for different types of bribery, and with the intention, so your question about direction, is being able to support civil society, anti-corruption practitioners who are designing interventions to address all of these different types of behavior. So understanding that different expectations, for example, drive behavior in one context just helps with you designing interventions a bit better. Understanding that perhaps, say, a particular kind of bribery is not supported by normative expectations, that most people really, are fed up with this type of bribery or this kind of behavior, they'll like it to stop. That is a powerful, I think one of the arguments we make in our report, that's a powerful opportunity for galvanizing collective action. If most people are tired of a particular practice and would like it to stop and are engaging it just because they believe other people or most people, as they rightly observe, are engaging in it, if you are able to design an intervention that provides the right kind of information, using the right channels, the right messengers, there's a bit of social network analysis dimension to that, to the design of these interventions that we haven't even begun to explore. But if you're able to structure these things well, you'll be able to kind of undo that collective action knot. One of the examples that we've used, and this happened independent and nothing to do with our project, is the End SARS, or the End Police Brutality movement that occurred in Nigeria about a year ago. It's about a year's anniversary. There's been police brutality, extortion by law enforcement going on for years and years and years. But it was really just a constellation of just people realizing that many people in Nigerian society are just fed up with, the police extorting people just on a daily basis. And you had this collective action, this protest movement erupt. Of course, these things, you cannot teleguide them, you can't, neatly organize them. but I think it just points to the point of what our research makes, that most people are quite mistaken or unaware about what other people in their community believe or think about a particular practice. And that norms of corruption, that even if you have a particular kind of corruption or just generally corruption being observed or frequent in a society, that doesn't mean that it has a normative component, that people accept corruption and just are happy to engage in it. They're just, just excited to just go out and bribe a police officer. Because I think to the point that was being made in the other session, it's really about citizen action. We want to be able to create or produce content or research that can stimulate citizen action, that can stimulate collective action. We want to be able to address fatalism. We want to be able to address people being fatigued, by corruption and just overwhelmed by the billions and billions and billions of dollars being taken out of the public purse, and the right kind of information, or at least well presented information about what other people in a person's community believe can, be a powerful tool for galvanizing collective action. So you can direct people's attention to specific behaviors and the specific, expectation drivers of that behavior. So it just makes it easier and just more locally specific, the way in which you would design an intervention. So you just pick your battles. You kind of know what works in one context. If this kind of bribery is underpinned by some normative component, it might be easier to go with one that has a descriptive component. That if you just tell people that most people, would rather this stops, that's a bit easier. And then you begin to tackle it from that angle. So it's just creating an opportunity for more specific behavioral interventions. That's kind of what our research is aiming to do. So it's not just bribery behavior. We're looking at a whole bunch of different behaviors, corrupt practices, of course, resource dependent and time and all of that. I hope that kind of answers your question.
Thank you very much, Leena. Now for the last set of responses, let's turn to Tomáš.
Okay, so thank you, Mihaly, for the very insightful question about generalizability. I think the fact or the question whether the approach can be generalized and whether the findings can be generalized are actually two separate questions, because the data collection framework, in my opinion, can be widely generalized to any settings where people may be dealing with data that is originally stored as some sort of text description. And in that regard, I would really encourage anyone to take our approach and try to use it, try to criticize it, build upon it, extend it to different national contexts, to different perhaps forms of storing textual files and so on. And then, of course, we can also compare how reliably and how sort of efficiently our approach works in other cases. In terms of generalizing the findings, all the cases that we deal with in the deferred prosecution agreements relate to corporate corruption, to put things simply. So there's some high-profile cooperation involved in bribery, manipulation of public contracts, and so on. And so findings from this research can be, I wouldn't say necessarily generalized, because I don't think we're at that point yet. But they could be meaningfully compared to similar cases from around the world. And then, of course, given sufficiently similar data sources and sufficiently similar handling of the data in terms of data extraction and data construction, they could also be eventually generalized. Just to sort of flesh out a little bit of those parallel research findings that I talked about, in the cases that we analyzed so far, we see that while there may be a lot of superficial variability in terms of how big the cases are or how long they actually lasted, if we look at the network structures we actually see remarkable similarities, and they relate to core periphery structures and to the way how temporally the activity and the amount of interaction spikes in certain periods and then sort of becomes basically non-existent in other periods. So those are some of the findings that I, for instance, mention right now.
Okay, thank you, Tomáš, and thanks again to everyone for all the responses. Just a last word from me as chair. 3 very interesting papers which bring out 3 different aspects of the use of data for being able to help control corruption. The first paper I thought was a great example. I mean, it was just nodding my head the whole time about the work that went into being able to take something that is publicly available but not terribly useful in the way it's presented and make it useful for analysis. So great appreciation for that. I also think for the second paper, Leena, the social norms approach, I think actually has some wide applicability, and it's not just about people's norms about their neighbors. I mean, there's applicability also to multinational corporations who go into a country, and we know that sometimes there can be the attitude, you know, when in Rome, and but their perception of what is normal in that country and what is expected or permissible in that country may not be accurate, and so I think there's a lot that can be done to draw those lessons for much more broadly. And the third paper on the analysis of deferred prosecution agreements, I also think that this is something that could be extremely useful for all sorts of investigative data. Whenever we read about the schemes where there is sort of a full disclosure of how things worked, whether it's part of an FCPA investigation or some other investigation, to help answer the question of how does corruption work and where are the weaknesses in the system. So all very important. So let me extend my thanks to all of the paper presenters and to your co-authors, many of whom might be listening, but for practical purposes allowed us to have one presenter each, and to Mishi for the excellent comments. We'll take a break now for 10 minutes and come back and start the next session. Sorry to cut into people's breaks a little bit, and we'll take a couple minutes out of the next session, but we'll start 10 minutes from now. Thank you very much. Okay, welcome back. Hope everyone had a nice short break. I think we're ready for the next session. This is measuring corruption in countries with some specific country applications, and I will turn over to the chair, who is Joel Turkewitz, IMF Legal Department, from the IMF Legal Department, and I'll leave it to Joel to introduce those who will be participating in this session.
Thanks so much, Jim. And I just want to check, can you hear me? Are we all good? Okay, great. Thanks so much. And good morning. My name is Joel Turkewitz. As Jim had suggested, I am with the IMF. I'm a senior counsel in the legal department. It's a great pleasure to have a chance to chair this session on the opening day, and really looking forward to what I'm sure is going to be a really excellent discussion and presentation. The session is entitled Measuring Corruption in Countries. And just as like a spoiler alert, you may think or be anticipating that what you'll now hear are a couple of presentations laying out new ways or sort of new country-wide ways of measuring corruption on kind of the way that we are kind of used to seeing things in terms of sort of things that allow us to be able to say country X has X amount of Y amount of corruption, and that means that it is better or worse than the next 12 countries or something of that order. I think one of the fascinating things about this session is exactly that this is not what you're going to hear. Instead, you're going to hear a couple of papers that really emphasize and focus on some different aspects about measuring corruption in countries, and in some ways, some of the challenges that face the entire approach around data analytics, and the things that will need to be considered as we get deeper into the data analytics and the being able to really capture all the richness that both the experience and the data reflects. There were 3 papers initially in the session. Unfortunately, we will only have 2 of the papers presented. The third presenter was unable to participate due to illness. So unfortunately, we will have 2 papers and a discussant. What I will do is I'll introduce each of the papers and the author separately, and then we'll go to the discussant. We have an hour, and I think we're supposed to end at 12:15, so we have a significant amount of time for the session. Please do write your questions in chats. We should have time for a question and answer session and interaction. So please do, as you're listening, pose questions in the chat, which we should be able to get to. So the first paper that we have is a paper called The Local Advantage, Corruption, Organized Crime, and the Indigenization in the Nigerian Oil Sector. The paper is written and presented by Jonah Rexer. Jonah Rexer is a postdoctoral associate with the Empirical Studies of Conflict Project and a lecturer in the Department of Politics at Princeton University. His research studies conflict, corruption, and economic development in fragile states. He holds a PhD in applied economics from the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, and an MPA in international development from the Harvard Kennedy School. So, Jonah, over to you.
Great. Should I share my slides?
Sure, please.
Right. Okay, great. Great. Thanks for having me, everybody, and thanks, Joel, for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here today to discuss my work on corruption in Nigeria's oil sector. So the motivation behind this paper is really the stylized fact in development economics that multinational firms tend to be more productive than local firms in developing countries, right? They have access to better human capital, better technology, perhaps better management practices. But there's a large class of markets, I argue, that multinationals might struggle in. Think about markets characterized by conflict or corruption or political instability. In these situations, local firms may well have the connections or the legal flexibility to get stuff done. So what I'm going to ask in this paper is really whether these benefits of localness, these kind of intangibles, can outweigh those technical advantages of multinational firms in these politically difficult markets. And since this is a conference about corruption, my kind of central mechanism is going to be about law enforcement corruption. And just to kind of explain what I mean by that, we know that in corrupt markets, political connections are very important for firms' success, right? And in particular, in markets that are characterized by crime and violence, these connections might be particularly useful, particularly to the state security forces like the military and police. And so when we think about the extractive industries of fragile states, what we often see are these black markets for natural resources that are run by organized criminal or armed groups. And these rackets are going to impose large costs on firms. What that means is that firms are going to have a substantial willingness to pay and kind of engage in corrupt activity to protect their assets. And what you're likely to see in these contexts is substantial amounts of law enforcement corruption and firms basically paying for law enforcement protection. And what this is really a variant of this kind of classic efficient corruption idea that firms are kind of willing to pay to get back past red tape or other barriers to doing business. And in this case, really that barrier is the existence of kind of violence and conflict and resource theft, right? And if violence is indeed a binding constraint to productive activity in these environments, we should expect actually that firms that are better connected to these corrupt networks can actually bring more legitimate production into the market and ultimately potentially enhance welfare, taxable revenue, and things like this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to study these issues in the context of the Nigerian oil sector. And I'm going to, exploit a wave of multinational asset divestments to local firms to look at essentially the effect of divestment on a wide variety of outcomes at the oil field level. And having established this concept of local advantage, I'm trying to identify the kind of corruption that underlies this local advantage phenomenon using a kind of standard economic bargaining model. And what I find essentially is that political connections are kind of the bedrock of this local advantage because they allow local firms to obtain more law enforcement protection on their assets. And so just to kind of preview the empirical results of this paper, what I find is that local firms, taking over an oil field leads to significantly more output, so about 60% increase in output, but also, some evidence that these local firms are of lower quality. That is, they kind of magnify the environmental externalities of oil production. In particular, we see a 50% increase in gas flaring and a 10% increase in oil spills. These are the kind of major environmental risks of oil production in Nigeria. But they're able to kind of, achieve this massive increase in output because they are able to reduce this political risk constraint substantially. This local ownership takeover leads to about 30% less oil theft, as well as reductions in militant violence and maritime piracy. And these are the major kind of political conflict risks and crime risks of production. And, again, the mechanism here is this law enforcement corruption idea. So local firms receive significantly more protection from law enforcement agencies of the Nigerian state, about an 80% increase in law enforcement, anti-oil theft law enforcement activity after a local takeover. And what I argue, again, is that this is driven by locals basically being plugged into corrupt networks in a way that multinational firms are not. So really what this paper is about is kind of getting under the hood of how corruption operates in a specific country setting. So let me give you a little bit more about that setting. The Nigerian oil sector is one of the largest in the world. I think it's the 10th largest oil producer in the world. And heavily dependent on oil revenues. That's about 80% of Nigeria's federal government income. And production has typically been concentrated in the southern Niger Delta, which is going to be the setting of our study, and historically has been dominated by really a small handful of multinational firms who produced about 95% of all output in 2004. But this is changing rapidly. So from the period of the late 90s to about a few years ago, the local market share of the oil sector grew from about 1% to about 13%. So huge growth in local participation. And there are a few sources of growth here. The first is, a policy reform explicitly designed to improve local participation in the sector. That's called the Local Content Act of 2010. And what we saw is that new licenses issued to local firms basically doubled in the years before and after this law. So there's a significant increase in local participation in that respect. And there's also this trend of divestments, essentially that multinational firms are selling off their assets to local operators. And so 34 oil fields have been sold by multinational to local firms over this 20-year period. And typically, just so you have some context, these are private sector indigenous firms. There's some direct state participation from Nigeria's national oil company, but you should think of this as, for the vast majority, like private local firms that are typically not listed on any international exchanges. They're privately held. They're somewhat opaque in their ownership structure, but I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. So let me just give you some kind of descriptives here. This is just a chart of the number of local firms on the left hand, the number of local fields, that is oil fields that are, or assets that are owned by local indigenous firms on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, their total market share. And I've split this out by the onshore and the offshore market for a very important reason, because as you can see, there's really a spike in local participation by either metric after this 2010 reform, but it's concentrated almost exclusively in the onshore market. And this is interesting because the onshore market is the market that's heavily exposed to these political risks of violence and theft, whereas the offshore market is relatively safe. And basically what you're seeing here is a kind of onshore, offshore sorting pattern by multinational and local It's basically, I argue, driven by their kind of differential appetite for an ability to deal with political risk. That is, the multinationals are kind of fleeing the onshore market, selling off their assets to locals who take those onshore properties, and then the multinationals are moving offshore because they can't kind of handle the risk. So what are these risks? Let me kind of dig into those a little bit more. There are two major kind of risks to oil production in Nigeria. The first is conflict. And so Nigeria's oil sector is really well known for violent competition over natural resource rents. And so from the first decade of the 2000s, we saw, really a full-on civil war where militant groups waged war on oil companies and the Nigerian state in order to kind of obtain a greater share of resource rents, both for the region and also for themselves. And primarily, the form of this war was kind of targeting oil installations with I guess, which you would call terrorist attacks, kidnapping of foreign oil workers, things like that, basically just making the kind of sector ungovernable. And it was very effective because in 2009, there was a kind of general amnesty, and a lot of these militant commanders got, pretty hefty sums of payoffs, essentially. And, as a result, infrastructure sabotage is still kind of a major concern. Even though the conflict is technically over, you see kind of new groups popping up, every so often. And so companies are very worried about their pipelines being bombed and things like that. And then the second risk that really is going to be the one that I focus on in this paper is this idea of oil theft. So in the aftermath of this civil war, what you see emerge in the Niger Delta is really what can only be described as an industrial scale black market for crude oil, which is siphoned directly from the oil pipelines in the Niger Delta. For example, in 2016, this market was worth about $4.5 billion, or 15% of Nigeria's national oil output. So this is kind of not a marginal phenomenon at all. It has a significant implication for Nigeria's overall budget balance. And at least it's argued that the security forces, so the Nigerian army and police, and the Navy to a lesser extent, are kind of intimately involved in this market by colluding with militant groups and international crime syndicates to extract these rents. So that's where the corruption comes in. And so I just want to kind of give you a sense of the type of costs we're talking about for firms. It should be somewhat obvious that this activity is really not good for firms. Here's just kind of a smattering of headlines from the kind of local and international business press. And what you see is, firms respond to this risk in a variety of ways. They shut down production. And so that's kind of pure losses for both the firm and the country. And they also move offshore, as I mentioned. And in some cases, they actually have exited the Nigerian market altogether. So the kind of disincentive effects of this activity are pretty substantial. And as I mentioned, law enforcement is alleged to be intimately involved in this activity. So this is where the corruption mechanism really matters. This is a report from a Nigerian newspaper, which basically argues that the JTF, which is the Joint Task Force, the kind of elite military unit that is meant to be policing oil theft in the Niger Delta, is in fact intimately involved in theft. And typically this takes the form of essentially protection rackets, where the state will protect different oil theft gangs in exchange for kickbacks. And that's a pretty common activity. That's kind of how the market is able to sustain itself so robustly. So what are we going to study here? Let me take you through my data. And since this is a conference about data, I will kind of focus a bit on this. First we need to measure productivity of these oil assets as well as their ownership status, right? And so to do that, I basically go through, government administrative records that report oil company production at the oil field level, so at the individual asset level. And about 70 of those, about 300 assets are ever owned by a local firm. And then kind of to augment that data on ownership, we put together data on corporate transactions. So this covers the kind of universe of all corporate transactions in the Nigerian oil sector, so that we really get a sense of how assets are changing hands and who's buying what from whom. And so that together will allow us to kind of get a sense of ownership structure in the market and local ownership in particular. And then to look at kind of key outcomes, of course, we care about oil theft and violence. Essentially what we're going to do is put together more administrative data from the Nigerian government. And this data comes from the environmental regulatory agencies, which record every oil spill that occurs and every kind of pipeline breakage. And within that data, you're able to fairly well identify which events were as a result of what they call sabotage, which is effectively a kind of euphemism for oil theft. And so we take all of those as our measure of oil theft. And then for these environmental outcomes, which we care about because we want to kind of understand the full cost benefit of this policy, we use the same administrative data set, but instead of those kind of third-party oil spills, we look at those that were due to basically company malfeasance, and that's kind of our environmental quality outcome. We also look at data on gas flaring, which is essentially when companies will burn natural gas at the site of the oil extraction. It's basically just a byproduct. And that's also hugely environmentally damaging. And so that's a kind of another major environmental risk. In terms of identifying the kind of law enforcement corruption mechanism, what we want to be able to see is that there's kind of a quid pro quo here. That is that these local firms are kind of receiving preferential protection. And so to do that, we have to measure law enforcement activity. And so to do that, we compile thousands and thousands of articles from the Nigerian press. It's very common to see Nigerian press report on like the police actions against oil theft, and so we put all of those together, and we code them. Get a variety of data out of those using a team of research assistants, and we geolocate those news articles so we can identify exactly where oil theft enforcement is happening and when. And lastly, in order to identify the networks, right, to see how the role of the corrupt network itself. We have to identify political connections at the firm level. And so what we do is we collect corporate filings from all the firms in the Nigerian oil sector. And those have, basically personnel records. And so by that, I mean your board members, your, senior management and your shareholders. And we use those kind of that personnel data to kind of do extensive biographical research on these folks and really try to identify all of the political connections that a firm might have. And this is kind of in cooperation with a local corporate research firm that typically does due diligence for corporate clients, but also works with academics. And so that gives us a sense of what the political landscape of these firms looks like. And this is an ongoing process, actually. So this paper is not completely done. I'm still working with this partner to kind of build a full map of political connections in the sector. Just to give you a sense of what the geography of this looks like, this is the southern coast of Nigeria, and these individual points are oil fields. And so the kind of the color of that oil field indicates the year in which it was indigenized or sold to a local firm. And as you can see, many were never sold. And so this gives us a lot of variation to work with. Over time and space in the extent of indigenization. So let me, jump to my main results here. And this kind of picture bears some explanation, so bear with me for a second. Here we have 4 panels. Each panel is a different outcome at the field level. So let's start with the top left. This is the annual production in millions of barrels of the oil field. And what the picture shows is essentially the level of production before and after an indigenization event, that is, before and after a local firm takes over, relative to a control group that has no indigenization, right? And so, this is called an event study plot, and basically it's trying to estimate the effect of this event, this indigenization event, on various different outcomes. So in the top left, that's annual production. What we see is a clear spike in production, even in the year that the field is turned over, and then kind of some growth thereafter as well. And on the right side, the top right, that's the number of oil spills. So this is our measure of kind of firm quality, that is, or environmental damage. And what we can see is that local firms, increase environmental damage pretty significantly. There's kind of a steady growth in in environmental effects after this local takeover happens. So, you know, local firms are more productive, but they're also of lower quality, right? So the kind of that's a bit of a paradox, because, you know, what's driving this productive advantage if it's likely the case that their technology and their standards, et cetera, are worse? Well, the explanation there is kind of on the bottom two pictures. So on the left-hand side, we see the number of oil theft events. And so that's, you know, clearly on a negative trend after the indigenization occurs, right? There's this kind of long-run reduction in oil theft events, which is equivalent to about 30% reduction per year. And then on the right-hand side, we see a similar trend with the number of oil-related conflict deaths. And so that's just a measure of the kind of militant activity. As I mentioned, that militant, you know, kind of pipeline bombings and things like that are also a major risk for firms. So both of those risks go down significantly after a local firm takes over. So, you know, we want to be able to explain this. I'm going to kind of go through a very brief theoretical framework that tries to make sense of these results, right? The question is, you know, why do local firms have an advantage in this political risk category? And this is where the kind of the details of the corruption in this market really come in stark relief. Essentially, in this model, firms are going to offer bribes to the police for law enforcement protection. But the police can also accept a bribe from the gangs as well and allow theft to occur. So, you know, a police officer is essentially trading off between a bribe from a gang and a bribe from a firm, right? So there's two forms of corruption essentially. One is the police protects the gang, and the other is that the police protects the firm, right? And one of those outcomes is more efficient than the other, right? And in particular, the outcome where the police protect the firm is what I call efficient corruption, right? It's socially efficient because there's these real costs to gang activity, in particular the destruction of oil output, and also the kind of costs that gangs themselves incur in doing business, right? So it's not efficient to have the gang basically steal oil. It is efficient to have protection for the firm. And what the model is going to do is going to highlight the role of political connections as a key constraint to this efficient corruption outcome. That is, firms that are connected essentially can align incentives, right? If, for example, you know, somebody on my board is a former or current member of the armed forces or the police, that means the incentives are aligned between the law enforcement agency and myself, and I basically don't have to bribe them because they already have an interest in protecting, right? So political connections are really a fundamental to aligning incentives between law enforcement and the firm, right? But there are other frictions that are also going to play a role. There's this idea of a corruption penalty, which is effectively like an expected legal liability of engaging in corruption. So if I'm a firm, I incur, you know, some costs of corruption because I may get caught and punished. And there's also this, you know, friction of partial ownership, which is that if I'm a firm, I'm also in a profit-sharing agreement, and so I may not completely internalize the losses from oil theft, and so I may not be willing to pay a large enough bribe. And the bottom line is that local firms may well kind of do better along all of these dimensions. They may be better politically connected. They may have lower corruption penalties because they're not exposed to international corruption regulations. And they may also have larger ownership shares. And so ultimately that means that they may be more willing or able to engage in this efficient corruption and get law enforcement protection and ultimately have an advantage in theft and output, right? And so there's kind of some clear predictions here, right? Is if this political connections mechanism is what's driving the local advantage via law enforcement corruption, there's a few things we should see, right? The first is that local firms do in fact obtain kind of preferential law enforcement protection. The second is that local firms are indeed better connected, particularly to law enforcement. And the last thing is that law enforcement connections should matter, right? They should matter for real outcomes, in particular for the level of oil theft. So let's just test these in the data one by one. Here again are some more of these event study charts that look at the effect of the local takeover. And the outcomes here are just various different measures of oil theft enforcement. So we have the total number of enforcement actions. We have the total number of seizures of stolen oil. we have the total number of raids on illegal refineries, which is like a downstream activity in the black market. And we have a total number of raids on illegal export, which is essentially like when the police will pull over a tanker and search the tanker and find a bunch of barrels of stolen oil, which these are all very common things that happen in the Niger Delta like every day. And so what we see here is a significant jump in anti-oil theft law enforcement exactly in the year that the field is indigenized, that it's taken over by a local firm. So really there's an immediate impact. Basically the kind of corruption equilibrium changes immediately and the police start doing their job effectively. And what that means, of course, is that you see this then long run reduction in oil theft, which ultimately means that 10 or 15 years out, there's basically no significant difference here. There's no need for additional enforcement because because legal activity has already been kind of eradicated on these assets. It's really like in the initial periods where you see this kind of jump in law enforcement activity. So basic takeaway is that there is a significant increase in law enforcement activity and that these local firms are in fact better protected by law enforcement. Now, are they better connected, right? Is it that these political connections are actually what's giving them this advantage? Well, here I'm just going to tabulate the number of firms with different types of political connections based on that data that I mentioned earlier on the board members and shareholders of these firms. Now, remember, this is somewhat preliminary data, but I think the pattern is still relatively clear. There's only 5 multinationals in the data. There's 33 local firms. And, as you can see, when we get down to like the connections to security forces, which is the last row here, there are no connections among multinational firms. That seems to be kind of like something, an activity that multinationals don't engage in at all. They don't recruit former, police chiefs or generals, but local firms do, right? 7 out of 33 local firms have some sort of political connection to the security forces, right? So they're significantly better connected to the people who are the intermediaries in this black market. And finally, do those connections matter, right? So here, what I'm showing you is a plot which basically shows you the effect of political connections on theft at the oil field level. Essentially, what this means is what happens to theft when a politically connected firm takes over a particular asset. And then I disaggregate that by the number or by the type of connection, right? So as we can see, any political connection is good, right? There's about 3 fewer oil theft events per year if you have a political connection on your board or your shareholders. And that effect is relatively constant, whether that connection is a technocrat. And what I mean by that is somebody who was formerly employed by the regulatory agencies or the national oil company, or whether that connection is a cabinet level official, like a secretary of energy or the treasury or something like that. So, those are basically constant, but where we really see the big effects, right, what really matters is this connection to the security forces. There, the effect is significantly larger, which is, of course, consistent with this idea that really like it's access to the corrupt networks that really protect you from asset, predation by these armed gangs. That's what really matters here, right? And so the kind of corruption that we care about is not just kind of generic, it's specific to one agency, and that is law enforcement agency. So just to wrap up here, what I find, of course, is that local advantage is quite substantial in the Nigerian oil sector. Local firms increase output, they reduce theft and violence, but they also, have some environmental cost as well. So the story is not completely rosy. And, to make the story even less rosy, they're doing better, but for a bad reason, right? They're essentially better at corruption. And so what that means is that they're able to align law enforcement incentives and obtain protection for their assets, right? So what we're seeing is not a fundamental reform of how the system works. It's just firms that are better able to operate within a corrupt system, right? And so I think there's a couple interesting policy implications here. The first is that this fact that I started with, that multinational firms are kind of better in a variety of ways, really may not hold in markets that are violent or corrupt. And I would argue that that kind of describes most of the extractive industries in the Middle East and Africa, at the very least, if not in other regions as well. And so, we need to revise our thinking about what really is the multinational advantage. And secondly, I think that there's some support here, at least for a variant of this idea of efficient corruption. And the variant is that, conditional on living in a corrupt system, there are certain kind of, access to certain corrupt networks can actually be not only privately beneficial for the firms, but also socially beneficial to the extent that it, in this case, reduces crime and increases the amount of legitimate production, which is ultimately good for the government's budget and things like that, right? So there are these kind of external benefits to political connectedness. And then the last piece is that, we typically don't potentially, typically don't like these indigenization policies because we think that they're, by we, I mean economists, think that they're protectionist potentially. They're inefficient. They may prop up inefficient firms or be kind of vehicles for rent transfers to local elites. But in this case, we see that, in the second best world where corruption and violence are endemic, these protectionist indigenization policies might actually be efficient. And I think that there are a bunch of open questions for future work, but I'm gonna leave it at that. And thank you so much all for listening.
Great, thanks, Jonah. Really interesting presentation, and I'm sure will elicit a variety of questions, which I once again sort of emphasize. People can please use the chat function to pose questions. Rather than take questions now, we'll move to the second presentation, and then the discussion, and then we'll come back. So the second paper is entitled Open Data as an Anti-Corruption Tool, Establishing a Framework to Enhance Accuracy of Data. This is going to be presented by Tatiana Martinez, who is a senior lecturer in information systems at Regent's University London. She holds a PhD in Management Information Systems, completed at the London School of Economics. Her co-author on the paper is Edgar Whitley. Edgar is an academic at the London School of Economics, where he teaches courses on data governance and information systems. He's the co-chair of the UK Cabinet Office Privacy and Consumer Advocacy Group, and has extensive research experience in digital identities, biometrics, and privacy. So one of the interesting things for me is also just the variety of backgrounds of people who are presenting papers in this session. So I'm going to move over to Tatiana. Tatiana, please.
All right, thank you. Let me just share my screen. Hopefully you can all see my slides.
Not yet.
No?
Yes, but now they're coming. Yes, we're good.
Okay. Trying to put it in presentation mode. Okay, I think that should work, right?
Yep.
All right, so our presentation, as you introduced, Joe, is on really exploring open data as an anti-corruption tool, trying to establish a framework to enhance the accuracy of data. The motivation for this really was looking at the data accuracy, which we know is an important factor when drawing analysis on the basis of open data sets. We need to ensure that the data that we're utilizing is accurate. And evidence suggests that corrupt public officials do intentionally conceal and misrepresent data, which means that, which makes this an important factor to look at. We found that there is little research actually regarding data quality, but most specifically data accuracy in open data sets. When we talk about the concept of data quality, that encompasses a series of different dimensions such as completeness and timeliness, but the dimension of accuracy seems to be one that is consistently overlooked. So that then motivated our research question in terms of how can accuracy of open data be improved to more effectively detect corruption. And we went about this by looking specifically then at the case of Brazil. Brazil is an interesting case because we know that it has made various strides and investments in terms of investing in open data and transparency. Historically, Brazil was one of the first countries to publish all of its data and put it online. It's consistently ranked as one of the most transparent countries in the world. It played a key role in establishing the Open Government Partnership alongside the United States. And yet we know that it consistently grapples also with corruption. So it is a bit of a paradox. And so whenever we talk about then open data and the use of open data as an anti-corruption tool, it seems that Brazil always falls outside of that what is expected of it. So we focused our efforts on looking at a specific agency. We call it Agency X. Which is a government agency situated within the Brazilian federal government. Agency X is a procurement agency, so it documents all of its processes, all of its procurement processes on the Brazilian Transparency Portal, which is open to public scrutiny. That's where all of the information regarding budget execution is transmitted via the Brazilian Transparency Portal. We therefore took a very micro level type of analysis into looking at how data is created and managed in corrupt environments. One of the reasons for why we picked this specific agency to look at is because we know we found evidence of corruption amongst its processes. So we were particularly interested in looking at how is it that they go about creating and managing and storing and publishing data. So it's a different focus of how usually you look at open data as a form of anti-corruption mechanism. So really drilling down to the source of it, to how it's created. We adopted distributed cognition as a framework, as a theoretical framework. This is a framework that was established by Hutchins in the 90s. What's particularly interesting about this framework is its emphasis on the distribution, the cognitive distribution of work activities between individuals, which Hutchins refers to as the human agents, and the technical artifacts. So how the distribution of work activities are how it's distributed between the individuals and the artifacts, focusing specifically then on the interplay between the agents and how these cognitive processes share between them. So the idea is that both individuals and artifacts work in tandem to produce information, each detaining a piece of the process. So you look at the production of data through these lenses, basically trying to identify who detains what part of that process of that creation of information. And we were particularly interested then in looking at the breakdowns of information, which we establish as the workarounds or deviations from the norms, which then impact the data flow and creation. So anything that doesn't conform to what is expected, to the way the process should be managed, we consider that to be a breakdown in the information process. The way we've applied distributed cognition to this study was then by taking then the cognitive distribution as the unit of analysis, and really focusing then on the distribution between agents who actively engage in a shared space. So both the human agents and the technical components, both of which then are working in tandem to produce an outcome, which is the data that is then published for public scrutiny through the Brazilian Transparency Portal. So in order to apply distributed cognition to this setting, we made use of a methodological framework, which is called distributed cognition for teamwork. Basically, it's a form of applying the different principles of distributed cognition and using that to analyze then the data that we collected. Distributed cognition for teamwork establishes 5 different models through which you can then analyze the data. We made use, in the case of this study, of 2 of the models, so the artifacts and the information or data flow models, because they were the ones that best illustrates where the breakdowns in the process then happen. So this is really just a big diagram with a lot of different steps which documents the procurement process undertaken then by Agency X. As you can see, it's a really, really long process. It consists of 39 different steps broken down into 8 different stages, and it touches upon a lot of different groups of individuals that span the entirety of Agency X. So basically, all of Agency X, all of the employees, the public officials there are involved in the procurement process, which I think it's something that really should be highlighted here when we then study then why then corruption continues to persist there. So looking then through the data that we collected and through then one of the models then, which is the artifact model, what we found then is that the main artifacts that are used are 3. The internal system, which was deployed at a ministerial level around 2011. So shortly after the Brazilian federal government enacted its access to information legislation. The other main technical system that it makes use of is called SIAFI, which is a technical system that is managed by the Brazilian Treasury. And the third main artifact used in this process is a physical file, so literally paper, a folder that is carried around through all the different stages. So when you look back at that very long procurement process, basically then the physical file is meant to really reflect everything that the technical systems are recording. At least that was the intention of having the paper files as well. But what we then saw through the gathering of information in through the course of the interviews that we had is that the physical file is in fact the main mediating artifact. It's the artifact, it's the component that acts as the trigger in the process. So it's what triggers the movement of the process into the next stage. It is the main source of history. So there it contains a lot more information than, funnily enough, the technical systems do, which seems counterintuitive and goes against what the whole deployment of these technical systems were designed to do. Which then obviously then creates some opportunities then for misrepresenting and concealing of information here and there. When we look then at findings and analyzing the data that we gathered through the data flow model, which basically describes then the data flows between the different agents and the communication channels used, what we find then that it's ultimately up to the human agents to move the information forward. So it's not the technical system that leads the information process, but it is in fact the people who dictate then what data gets stored and how it gets stored into the technical systems or into the physical file. So this obviously creates several opportunities for informal channels of communication. And again, for lots of data then to not be stored into the technical systems. So how does this translate then into the breakdowns? Basically then, what we find then is that the technical component, which was designed then as designed and deployed as the system to support all of this transparency and open data environment, it enforces certain processing rules. It basically dictates how information is registered onto its own systems according to its imbued properties, but not what gets stored or even when it gets stored. So often what we see happen then is when there is the intention then to misrepresent information, that doesn't, what is stored there doesn't accurately reflect when these stages or processes took place. It may be the case that the whole process has already been finalized, the whole procurement process has already been finalized, but the data then will only be stored on it after the event has taken place, which means that the data that then is produced and published through the transparency portal doesn't necessarily reflect reality. So there is a very uneven distribution of cognitive processes between the components of the systems, which then allow and facilitate these breakdowns of information. And we classify these breakdowns into both intentional and non-intentional breakdowns. The non-intentional being mistakes that are made. People are people, they make mistakes. Technical systems sometimes, fail us. It's not necessarily with the intent to conceal or misrepresent. And the intentional breakdowns are those that are defined precisely as that, as the intentional act of concealing or misrepresenting data. The impact, obviously, of this is that you have compromised and incorrect data being stored on the technical systems, which don't portray reality, and that are then published through the transparency portal. And that is the data that then is given to civil society to act and scrutinize, which basically means that the entire thing is compromised in terms of its effectiveness. To summarize then our main conclusions then, I would say that distributed cognition, which we use then here for this study, is a useful framework for observing how data is created and to identify then possible breakdowns in the information process flow. Breakdowns do compromise data accuracy and do then bear an impact in terms of the effectiveness of open data as an anti-corruption tool. How the system is designed does facilitate the perpetuation of corruption and the creation of opportunities for individuals to circumvent detection. So the fact that the internal system that was designed to support this transparent and open data environment that is being pushed through the Brazilian federal government, the fact that it does have limitations then does create opportunities then for individuals then to misrepresent and conceal information. And we propose then that detection should happen at a micro level of analysis. So whereas we've always, when we think about data analytics, we think of looking at it from a more macro level. We suggest that maybe a more micro level, a more granular approach should be adopted in terms of detecting then and trying to enhance and looking at the data accuracy aspect. So I look forward to whatever questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. Really interesting paper on this interface, a portion about data analytics that we often just jump past. The thought that we're just dealing with data and data systems, that means just discount or fail to see a little bit of this human element. So really interesting. Thanks so much. I'm going to bring in our discussant now, Cristina Aquino, who will discuss both of these papers, which clearly are quite distinct and have very different sort of approaches and thinking about it. Let me just introduce Cristina. Cristina is an operations officer for the World Bank, where she works on trust fund and partnership policies and issues. Previously, she worked for the governance global practice on projects that supported clients with open government, procurement reform, and citizen engagement policy implementation. Her research interests include procurement transparency, anti-corruption data analytics, and open data policies. Cristina has an MA in global diplomacy from I'm in mid-paragraph from the University of London and completed her master's research on the internationalization of procurement and government policies. And Cristina worked very, very strongly on some of the open data and open transparency work. So over to you, Cristina.
Great, thanks, Joel, for the nice introduction. Hello, everyone, and thank you to the panelists who shared very, very interesting research. Also, thanks to the organizers for this chance to read and react to the papers that were discussed and presented in this session. They all offer new perspectives on how we can undertake corruption research in countries in their own distinct areas, right? Before diving into it, I should say that as Joel mentioned, I come at this from my experience with transparency and procurement policies and platforms. So a quick plug for you to join the session, the technical session on PROACT tomorrow, which I will reference once or twice during my talk today. PROACT is a global platform that collects open procurement data from 100+ countries. So there's a lot to say on these two papers, but I wanted to leave room for Q&A and discussion. So let me focus my main reactions on the question that the topic title presented to us. So what new measurements or insights and measurements for corruption can we glean or get from the paper? So let me start with Jonah's presentation, the first presentation on the Nigeria oil sector, which I think provides an interesting way to measure the impact of corruption, that is political connections and rent-seeking behaviors, on efficiency or production in a quite risky sector, the oil sector. It's a rich intersection of three very important themes of resource conflict, public-private interface policies, and corruption impact in a sector. One way to look at it is as a study of how to improve business outcomes in a corrupt environment, if not how to adjust policies to mitigate corrupt advantages. So a caveat, this is not my sector of expertise, so I'll focus my comments on the relevant data approaches and governance policy implications. So overall, I really appreciated the distillation of complex dimensions of conflict risk, protection rackets, and resource rents into trackable and observable data. Particularly interesting for me is the use of corporate and biographical data to extrapolate political connections. So on the research side, I'm personally very interested in understanding this approach to measuring this dimension on political connection. Very, very useful for those of us, some of us are in this call already, but those in the bank and outside working on corruption patterns and investigations, for example. So personally, I think it's an important discussion to have as one of the more popular ontological narratives about corruption and corrupt networks in recent years is that it has become quite sophisticated and hidden, right? So I'm curious to see what empirics of corruption emerged from the paper's approach to constructing political networks. Is there anything new that you may have seen? I know it's not exactly the focus or deep dive of the paper, but anything new that we may have not seen from similar data sets before? Any other political intermediaries that are perhaps less obvious? You think using more data or newer approaches, such as maybe machine learning or social media analysis, text-based modeling, can enhance localized understandings of political connections and enhance the model? Not very easy questions to answer, and some of them are still hypothetical, but just putting it out there maybe for future considerations. What the research puts forward in terms of conclusions on efficient corruption is also worth commenting on. In the paper, the case for localization of oil production in this context is very clear. But the so-called oil curse affects countries economically in more ways than one, right? I know this is again beyond the scope of the paper, but I think also worth mentioning mismanagement of oil revenues by government makes it overall more expensive to operate in this sector, as you have rightly pointed out, Jonah, as well. It increases overall environmental impact and reduces benefits for the majority of citizens. From a more longitudinal view, perhaps, I would argue that there's still real collective bargaining challenge among operators, local and multinational, to address corruption dysfunctions, even in these situations where market distortions may have been seemingly mitigated by important players through the localization policies. So I wonder how the efficiency approach also in the paper, used in the paper, syncs up with the value chain approach or perspective to extractive resource management. Governments and civil society often use the value chain as an alternative diagnostic tool to assess policy options and trade-offs for managing their natural resources. Improved governance helps maintain benefits across this value chain, and I think the paper has real insight to offer on policy options for managing resource contracts. Without upstream coherence on policy frameworks and actions against corruption, real redistribution of economic gains may not happen. And at a broader scale, if governments don't really look at this, one might ask, what's the point, right? My next point refers to the lack of international oversights and standards that typically MNC multinationals participation bring into the picture that is lacking in a more localized approach. This means that there are overall less incentives for better governance in the sector. So it would be interesting to see what a local intermediary model of production could look like. You mentioned this, I think, in your concluding slide, maybe through a joint venture between local and multinational companies. Would it impact efficient corruption as you've modeled it? Could it help improve the overall regulatory environment while maintaining efficiency gains in a purely local model. I guess, put it simply, if we enhance local connections of multinationals, then the model predicts improved efficiency and better overall performance in the sector. On the opposite side, can that approach also be used to improve local capacity, to increase gains and reduce environmental costs? Lastly, going back to the question of measuring corruption, is this a model that would hold for other sectors with similar assumptions? So I can think of, for instance, similar conflicts and activities around waterline provisions, which are already, I mean, there's already a theory that hyper-localized operations do better in these the service delivery. Mining could also be one, and other shared commodity-focused sectors. So again, thanks, Jonah, for the chance to comment. Really interesting paper, really, I think really helpful and provides us a good starting point for defining or redefining more specifically some of these dimensions of corruption. On the second paper, Tatiana and Edgar's paper on Brazil, which looked at how we could understand or track, if not measures per se, how data in public institutions is produced in a hybrid online-offline setting, and provides us with a framework for understanding gaps and misalignments in public data sets. What my key takeaway from this is the more offline or human touch points there are, the less reliable the data becomes. And the more we see intentional or unintentional breakdowns. I was thinking as I was reading it, it's too bad or it's so unfortunate that data doesn't include a metadata for intention. So we can't really tell when there's a breakdown, if it's intentional or unintentional. So why is this important? It's important to critically look at why open data falls short of promised outcomes. And I'm saying this as an advocate, right? Despite seeming technical success. The framework helps us unearth the hidden challenges of open data reforms, especially in systems that are still moving from paper-based to fully electronic, and why transparency policies should not really be undertaken in a silo approach without other systemic adjustments. I'll give you a concrete example at a global level. In my own research, I've seen that around 80% of countries belonging to the Open Government Partnership have adopted, at one point or another, procurement transparency policy commitments. They're all at different levels, but you could categorize them and lump them under that heading. Yet critics and supporters alike have continued to bemoan the missing link between why are we pushing so much for procurement transparency and where's the link to real outcomes, right? I wonder if we're looking for the missing middle while we ignore fundamental gaps in the actual openness, which you've coined as accuracy of the data, which I tend to agree with, which could have long been co-opted by existing problematic processes. I think this also leads us to reflect on how we can, as global citizens, help adjust open data standards and norms to respond to these challenges. Open data norms are always geared at technical openness, though not always for its usefulness in promoting accountability norms. What I mean is that data standards make it easy to check on the data for completeness and timeliness, like what the paper says, I completely agree, but extremely less easy for integrity. At the global level, inaccurate data has a direct impact on the usefulness of global systems, which rely on country data sets. One example of this is PROACT. However, I don't think that this is a check that can effectively happen at that international level. Data production is quite local, and inconsistencies of the nature that we're talking about can be quite specific. I wonder, and also time sensitive, I might add, I wonder if we did not know where to look and what to look for, if we were looking purely at the data, would it have been so easy to detect these inconsistencies without the absence of that localized knowledge? So the challenge is that while open government data is increasingly governed by global norms, effective and accurate data production needs to be addressed in its own context. I think that's a huge challenge, one that requires underscoring. So then is it enough to champion transparency policies? In these periods or situations of yet imperfect transparency techniques, meeting technical requirements for openness may not and should not completely supplant internal checks within or laterally across government institutions or even other forms of accountability. I think that particularly for procurement, if we look at data we only look at data ex post, we've already missed the point. The last thing I want to say is that procurement data and systems as an area of inquiry is extremely relevant and more so in recent times. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, many countries struggled to respond due to supply chain disruptions, among other issues. A World Bank survey regarding the use of countries' own procurement systems for procuring for COVID-19 showed that emergency procurement modalities have less ex-ante oversight, and that transparency and accountability standards overall deteriorated compared to pre-pandemic times. However, somewhat insulated from these risks are more well-developed systems that were more adaptable to the urgent and changing demands of the emergency. So I think the paper posits strongly that data production and management is not a neutral activity. I agree. Systems are not inherently corrupt. Humans are. At least data systems or technical systems. Overall, the two cases we saw today are useful for examining how actors behave in a corrupt ecosystem and how corruption interacts with other elements like transparency and productivity. It was interesting to see different approaches to measuring effectiveness of anti-corruption measures, corruption impact on business, as well as defining specific dimensions of corruption, while conclusions that would definitively support more positive longitudinal effects of anti-corruption may still be elusive. Maybe it's helpful just to reaffirm that structures and systems do shape actors' decisions. Corruption acts, they don't really occur in a vacuum. I'll stop there. I think plenty more to say, a lot of questions. But again, thanks for the opportunity to comment. Looking forward to a spirited discussion. Thanks, Joel, and over to you.
Thanks a lot, Christina. We don't have that much more time. I actually saw that we're supposed to have about 10 minutes. But let me give the floor over to the two presenters. I would just ask that you keep comments relatively short to react to Christina's comments. I would just try and ask you to keep your comments relatively short, just so we can sort of bring in a couple of others. Let's start and we'll go in the same order. Jonah, do you want to come in on the different points that Christina?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Christina. That was really insightful. Close reading. So I really appreciate that. I'm not going to respond to everything because there's a lot there, but let me just pick out a few. I found it interesting that you kind of, you talked about the way the data is constructed with political connections and these kind of corrupt networks. And yes, there's like a lot of interest now in trying to identify, beneficial ownership and stuff like that. And so we do some of that, right? We basically go one level up in terms of our beneficial ownership. What's interesting in the Nigerian context actually is that people don't go, and this probably is an indication of how normalized corruption is in this context, is that like you can find, corrupt networks without even going several levels up in the beneficial ownership network. It's basically out in the open. And so it's not like the offshore, financial system at all, where there are these like networks of shell companies and everything. It's all like pretty much right there, or at the most like one level up in terms of beneficial ownership, which of course I don't think is representative of a lot of different markets. But in these very corrupt markets, in the local markets and not in kind of the international financial markets, I think it's actually quite easy to identify these networks like using this approach. You made some other interesting comments about broader kind of sector-wide governance reforms. And I want to point out that I don't think that this localization is kind of any sort of silver bullet, right? And it's certainly not a substitute for sector-wide reforms that would improve governance in the sector, right? Nigeria has a major problem, and I think other countries do, that there's effectively no, sector-wide legal framework at all. So they've been kind of debating and trying to discuss reforms for the oil sector for decades, but have never been able to get anything through their Congress. So it's basically kind of chaos, and it's highly discretionary at the kind of discretion of the minister in terms of which assets are able to be sold, what the legal framework is, how contracts are written. So it's a mess. And so I guess my point is just that this is a way of improving outcomes conditional on that type of background, right? That background situation. But it's certainly not a substitute for kind of like deeper reforms. But I would argue that a lot of countries are in a situation where corruption is so entrenched and so endemic that, like, in some cases, you know, the best we can hope for is actually to kind of improve outcomes in a kind of second best world. And to that extent, I think, you know, this indigenization program really does a lot of good. I wanted to also just make one more point. You kind of mentioned, you know, how we can extend the approach of measuring corruption, you know, potentially using machine learning or other tools. And I think that that's a really interesting area of future work. What I think is quite useful about my approach to identifying the corrupt networks is that it basically allows the outcomes to tell you which intermediaries are important. So for example, when I show you that chart about the police and security forces being like the kind of major intermediary, that's completely data driven, right? Even though I have a prior that's going to be the case, given what I know about the context, you could think about you know, applying that more broadly. And basically the idea is you can infer from which assets are more protected and which assets receive, you know, are victims of less conflict and less risk, you know, and what are the connections of the firms that own those assets, right? And so one could imagine using machine learning to identify the types of connections and the types of networks that are most advantageous in many, many different contexts. I mean, I'm thinking of particularly the natural resource sectors, but I think you could probably apply this more broadly as well. So yeah, I mean, thanks a lot for those questions. Really great comments.
Great, thanks. Tatiana, over to you.
Thanks, Christina, for all of your comments. I agree with a lot of what you said. I share some of the sentiments regarding, you know, it's the production of data is not a neutral activity, you know, and what does that mean in terms of pushing for policies from a global perspective when you have these things taking place at a very much local level, and which, yeah, from a more global perspective, and it's one of the conclusions, you know, looking at this from a very macro level, it's easy to miss. So you need perhaps to think about, you know, policies in this regard, you know, digging down to a more granular, more micro level. I think when thinking about policy making, then from push for best practices, but then ultimately, you know, how this translates into the local context that needs to be taken into account. One of the things that I'll just pick from Jonah's comments, you know, because it's something that I found as well, regarding the normalization of corruption, and it's very much true for the Brazilian context as well. It's and what that means then in terms of, you know, when you're trying to identify where corruption is taking place in these different agencies, which we had to do, you know, to identify Agency X as our case, is that corruption is actually not as covert as one would imagine. You know, you look at the literature and you think, you know, it's very covert, you know, people really, really hide it away. But the fact of the matter that is actually not. The only difference actually that I would say is that how you go about naming it. If you ask people, then, you know, is corruption taking place here? Usually the response that you get is no. If you then talk about then processes, you know, deviating from norms, et cetera, you know, things that maybe don't really conform to what's expected or expectations, then people are more forthcoming. Okay, yeah, actually, I have seen this or I have seen that. Also in the case of Agency X, as you saw, you know, the whole agency, you know, is involved in the procurement processes. But the people who actually benefit, you know, monetarily speaking, from these acts of corruption, they're just a little portion of people. So even though pretty much everyone is involved in the process in facilitating that, because you need the cooperation of pretty much everyone there, only a few people are benefiting personally from it. So I think that's something also that, you know, needs to be taken into account. And that's actually something that then I explore much further in my thesis, which is where, you know, this was extracted from. But yeah, thanks very much for your comments. like I said, I agree with a lot of what you said. I don't think it means that, we don't push for open data as a form of anti-corruption, measure. It just means that, what ways do we need to look at to make it more effective, to improve the accuracy of data, because that's ultimately that does compromise then the integrity, of the and effectiveness of it as a tool.
Thanks so much, Tatiana and Jonah. So thanks. We're pretty close to the end of the session, which I think is a fascinating session. In that sort of gets under the cover in some ways of data analytics in two different ways. One about actually the data, and the second a little bit about my sense of what does it mean to sort of measure corruption in a country. Given sort of the different ways corruption sort of is shaped by the different actors. For me also, the papers brought up a number of different questions. I mean, so I had a little bit question of, actually, is it true that the levels of corruption are unchanged in the Nigeria case? Is actually putting someone on your board different than actually bribing the police in terms of actually how they act? And does it give you different possibilities in terms of actually transition processes? So I had a little bit of a question of, well, actually, is this actually a true comparison, or actually are there significant differences in thinking about what corruption means if it's about someone on your board versus others? I think also one of my takeaways from the data piece was, I think we have some sense about, well, we're going to automation and therefore people will stop becoming important. So this whole idea of kind of data is a black box. As long as we build the box, we're all good because the data will just be generated and we'll just be able to analyze. And this is probably not such a useful way of thinking about data. And the ways, as you say, the architecture of data and the way it influences, it shapes who actually participates in both the data input as well as the structure of the data. It sort of highlights for me some evidence that I've seen where even in countries that go to integrated financial management information systems, only something like 30% of the transactions are picked up oftentimes, and there is some reason to believe that it's not a random 30% of those transactions that are picked up, but there is some selectivity going on about what transactions get picked up and what don't. So this whole idea, I think, of how we actually relate to data and the expectations that somehow this, because we call it data, that means it must be accurate and must be usable, and as long as it's in the right format, we're all good. So I think really interesting two presentations. I think lots to build upon here. And I think one of the things it shows is in some ways the maturation of data analytics fields in corruption, because it's not just about volume of data, it's actually thinking about what that data demonstrates and reflects, and how, what are the units of analysis and what's going to be needed in order for those units of analysis to actually be both informative and help lead to policy and policies and policy recommendations. Let me stop here. I want to really thank and greatly appreciate Jonah, Tatiana, and Edgar for the great work and really interesting papers. I think everyone would be quite interested to see how this continues to develop and move. I'd like to thank all of the people and the participants. I see we still have 71 people joined, which is fantastic. Great to see this. And once again, thank you for the organizers for doing this. I think this ends. I'm not sure if I switch back to Jim, but from my basis, thank you so much for the participation and a really exciting.
Thank you, Joel. Can I just get a wave to be sure people can hear me? Okay, good. So thank you very much for the second session. A couple of more very interesting papers. As we wrap up for today, let me just give a quick preview of tomorrow. So tomorrow, we're going to start at 8 o'clock Washington time with machine learning techniques and advanced data to detect corruption. And that'll be chaired by our colleague, Alexander Habershon. Then we're going to have a session, a 30-minute session on PROACT that we've already heard about a few times today, the Procurement, Anti-Corruption, and Transparency Platform, and Mihaly Fazekas from Government Transparency Institute will present that platform. Then we're going to have one of those lightning talks that I mentioned on Digintegrity, how data and technology are leveraging integrity policies in Latin America. And that'll be by Camilo Cetina from Development Bank of Latin America, CAF, which is also one of our partners for the symposium. We're also going to have another session on leveraging technology to improve the management of integrity risks, detecting patterns through data. And this is from our colleague here at the World Bank's INT Vice Presidency, which does investigations. Marcelo Donolo will do that. And then we're going to have another session with papers that were submitted as part of the symposium on measuring corruption transnationally. Erica Bozio from the World Bank will be chairing that session. Thank you all for posting in comments in both the chat and the Q&A session. There are a few questions that I think are more for us, the organizers, and for all paper authors. One was about, will we be sharing the papers? Many of them are works in progress, and so our recommendation is if you want the paper to reach out to the authors of the paper. There was also a question about presentations, and we'll check with the authors about being able to share those. There was also a question about when papers reference open data and code, open code, would it be possible to share the links to those? And we'll also look into seeing if we can find an efficient way to collect that information and share it with you. But that's it for day one of the symposium. Thank you very much, and see you tomorrow. We'll start again at 8 o'clock Washington, D.C. time, 8 o'clock in the morning. Thank you. Good day.